Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto became the king of all vampire clans? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. Crown of Night. Dusk fell hard along the border road. A bruised strip of sky pressed low over the hills. The wind came off the pines smelling like sap and old iron. Naruto jogged the ridge without effort, light on the balls of his feet. Eyes tracing a smear of smoke that wasn't campfire and wasn't weather. Hinata ghosted beside him, quiet as turning a page. Her Byakugan was already open, veins faint around her eyes. 7 signatures, she said, voice low. Fast. Their chakra coils. Hot. Talisman interference. Vigil. Naruto asked. She didn't answer, but her frown did. They came over the crest and saw the road unspo. Into a shallow valley streaked with pale dust and broken cart wheels. There, figures in white-limbed coats drove something small into the gully. The small thing moved wrong, too quick, too desperate. And when the hunters cracked a bundle of paper charms and daylight burst out in a harsh spill, it screamed. Not a bandit, not a missing nin, a child. Naruto didn't decide. His body just went. He dropped from the ridge like a thrown knife, hit the slope in a slide, and threw 3 kunai without looking, 2 into the shoulders of the lead hunter, 1 into the chain of the net they were about to cast. Hey, Naruto's voice carried like it had always carried. Pick on somebody who can pick back. The hunters moved together, as disciplined as any squad he'd fought. Sun-ink tatters fluttered on their sleeves. One pulled a tube from his belt and cracked it. A daylight flare sizzled, cutting a hard-edged shape onto the dirt. Talisman snapped, forming a grid. Hinata arrived with the wind, flicking a palm into a hunter's ribs. The talisman on his chest guttered and died like a candle in rain. She pivoted, eyes sighting lines beneath skin, the map of everything that made a body move, and tapped 2 points in the same heartbeat. The man folded. The child darted past Naruto's boots, fast and feral, clutching something to their chest. A loop of ash-colored beads tied around a painted charm. Their eyes flashed, too bright in the gloom. Under the carts, Naruto told them, without turning. Stay low. Abomination, a vigil inquisitor hissed, and the word hit the air like a thrown rock. He flicked a talisman. The paper writhed and stiffened into a web of bright silk. By the light, kneel. Hard pass, Naruto said, and cut the web. Wind chakra hummed along the edge of his kunai, just a whisper, just enough. The silk parted. He stepped into the opening, driving an elbow and a knee in quick succession. The Inquisitor went down with a grunt. Another hunter threw a flask, and the world became white. Sun oil burst like a false dawn, the gully lines erased. It should have been blinding. There was no cover, only raw glare. Naruto felt the burn sear his skin in thin straight lines, like the edges of a drawn square. He ducked and rolled forward, trusting Hinata to feel him, trusting the way they moved together. He counted by habit. 1, 2, and came up inside the perimeter of a man still drawing his sword. He knocked the blade away with the guard of his kunai, pivoted, and drove his shoulder into the man's sternum. Your eyes, Hinata murmured, close as breath. Her hand found his wrist. And for an instant the drawn square of glaring light softened. She had turned the glare itself, just enough to give their bodies edges again. A small technique she'd been working on, half-formed. Keep them closed if you need. Can't. I'm handsome, Naruto said, because the joke kept his breath light and the fear small. Kurama rumbled in his chest, old heat and wry amusement. Try not to set yourself on fire for once, Kit. Workin' on it, Naruto thought back, and dove. The child had wedged themselves under a wagon topper. A hunter crouched to drag them out, gauntlet sparking with talisman script. Naruto planted a hand in the dirt and kicked off, spinning. Heel met jaw. The man hit the cart, slumped, and slid down with a smear of blood on his collar. Hey, Naruto said to the kid, crouching, not touching. You okay? The child bared small teeth. Their lips were cracked around them. You'll sell me, they whispered. They all sell us. Not today, Naruto said, and the tone did what words sometimes couldn't. He tipped his head toward the ridge where shadows pooled. We're going that way, with your permission. A pause. The child stared at his hand, then him, then the hunter's boots. Okay. They breathed. Okay. Hinata. Left. Naruto snapped, and she was already there. Her palm met paper midair, and the talisman fizzed out like a ruined firework. When the hunter tried to backhand her, she slid under. Tapped his elbow, and the arm went dead. She caught his talisman band with 2 fingers and tore it free. The last vigil man on his feet realized their grid had failed and did what trained men do. He cut losses. He threw a whistle carved from something pale that wasn't bone and blue, long and shrill. A return signal answered from the tree line. Reinforcements. Time to go, Naruto said. He scooped up the child. Not too tight, not trapping, and tossed 2 smoke bombs into the light. The oil caught the smoke, threw weird shadows over everything. He ran for the ridge. Hinata fell in behind, feet almost silent. A talisman charge bolt hissed past Naruto's ear and pinned the corner of his jacket to a sapling. He shrugged out of it without breaking stride. Nice jacket, he called over his shoulder. Didn't like it anyway. They crested the ridge as more white-limbed figures broke the tree line below. The sun sat fat and red on the horizon, bleeding out into purple. Naruto cut sideways, into the little notch where the pines thinned and rock took over. The child's breath trembled against his collar. They'll follow. They can smell. They can smell. What's your name? Naruto said. The child chewed the inside of their cheek like the name had been taken from them and they had to make a new one. Ray. Okay. Ray. You know a place with doors the sun doesn't fit. Ray's eyes flicked to a slab of rock that looked like more rock. There. Hinata reached it first, fingers tracing grooves so fine they were almost nerves. She pressed, turned, and the slab side opened like an old book. Exhaling stale cold, Naruto slid inside, turned sideways to fit, and the stone folded shut behind them. They stood in a choked darkness, all breath and heartbeats. Then lanterns awoke one by one. Without flame. Little foxfire pearls nesting in cages of wire, casting clean, dim circles. The passage sloped down. Don't like caves, Kurama muttered, a memory wearing teeth. Too many seals back in the day. Yeah, but the surface has men with sun in bottles, Naruto replied inside himself, already moving. Pick your poison. Stay close, Hinata told Ray as they slid deeper. There's a drop soon. How do you? Ray started. Byakugan, she said simply, and allowed a small smile, gentle as rain. I can see the veins of the world when I need to. The tunnel widened and dropped into a cavern so large Naruto felt it before he saw it, the way sound pulled away, the way his steps fell without echo for a breath and then returned from far off like someone else's. The first bridge hung across the gulf like a string in a throat. Below them, a city unfurled. Stacked rooftops stitched with red threads, balconies curled like shells, markets tucked under latticed awnings. Lanterns swam through the air at about knee height, obedient to unseen currents. Ray exhaled a sound between a sob and a laugh. Home, they said, and then bit the word like it might break if they let it out whole. Naruto felt all the little eyes that lived in the dark turn toward him. He lifted his chin, not challenging, not meek either. He had walked into stranger rooms, and this one at least had honest walls. Footsteps whispered over the bridge. She came with them, her presence arriving before sight did, a cool incision of attention. Yorua wore black like it was a good joke only she knew, fabric that drank light. And at her hip a sword hung simple and old. Her hair was pinned with what looked like red silken cords that were not cords. The threads floated and settled as if they had opinions. She stopped at the bridge's center and looked him over as if he were a set of tools someone had left in the wrong place. Then she looked at Hinata, read her stance, the steadying palm on the child's shoulder. The way she tracked 3 angles at once. Yorua's mouth tipped at one corner, approval, or maybe relief that at least one of the daylight walkers had sense. Finally she looked at Ray, and all the cool came off her voice. You made it, Yorua said, and the threads in her hair uncurled, bright as cut veins. Who hunts you? Vigil, Ray whispered. They want to make us clean. How very generous of them. Yorua's gaze flicked back to Naruto. You brought them down our spine, Daylight Man. Didn't have time to leave them a fruit basket and a map, Naruto said. If they find us, that's on me, and I'll pay it. But the kid needed out. Ray stood straighter at kid, not child, not monster. Yorua held his eyes for a beat longer than polite and let silence do some heavy lifting. Naruto didn't look away. Finally she said, "You plan to pay it in coin, apology, or blood?" "Leadership," Naruto said simply. "If trouble comes through me, it's my job to stand in front of it until it forgets everyone else." Something like surprise threaded her expression, and then her posture changed not at all, but everything in it went from braced to curious. "You speak like a king. That can be a dangerous hobby down here." "Good thing I collect dangerous hobbies," Naruto said. Her smile this time was not a smile at all, it was a blade laid flat so no one bled by accident. "Come." They followed her on a ladder of stone ribs to a market that smelled like warm iron and sweet herbs. A nightingale singer, face painted with a line of sound across the cheeks, tuned something that wasn't a flute and wasn't a pipe and made the air feel like water. Dusk wolves in half-shift dozed under a stall, ears twitching in their sleep. White ash smiths haggled with a woman over a crate of ward chalk, leaving little bright freckles on their hands. Onyx vein silhouettes edged rooftops, almost there and very aware. Naruto filed the names without saying them. The words would break if he spoke them before he earned the right. Yorua brought them to a building like a closed eyelid. The door opened silently to her palm. Inside, a room without corners. The walls curved like a throat descending. In the center, waist high, stood an oval of glass half as long as a man. It was not glass. It had depth and a slow pulse. Naruto felt his heartbeat stutter, then steady. "The blood mirror," Yorua said, very quietly. "The crown's eye. It opens for those who can bear to be seen by it. It kills those who can't." Ray flinched. Hinata reached for Naruto's wrist and didn't take it, just hovered there, warm. "Choice?" Naruto asked. Yorua inclined her head. "Always. If you turn away, we will call you guest, and your debt will be paid in honest fight for the common safety. If you step forward and it takes you, we will sing your name and return your bones to the river. If you step forward and it chooses you," her voice thinned out like smoke on a high wind, "then I will tie my oath to your hand, and the night will listen when you speak." Hinata said, "Naruto," and her voice had that edge it only got when she wanted him alive more than she wanted anything else. "We can ask them to hide Ray without." "I know." He wanted to put his hand over hers and let the warmth close the distance. He wanted a lot of things. He walked forward. The mirror did not show him. It showed a dozen Narutos hanging in soft dark, the way fish hang in a deep pool just out of reach of the sun. One wore a crown of teeth and smiled like hunger. One wore no crown and bent under the weight of everyone else's sorrow until his spine made a question mark. One had his hands read up to the wrist and held them out like scales, counting. One rested against a wall with his eyes closed, listening, and the room was crowded with people breathing because he had told them to. They moved when he moved. They didn't when he didn't. He stepped closer and the glass burned cold through the heat of his palm. A sting climbed his wrist like an old scar waking up. "You want to know if I'm a monster," Naruto said. "The truth as I can be. Anyone can if you take away sleep and shame and give them a cause they think is pure." He reached toward the Naruto with red wrists. The reflection flinched from his hand, as if he would blanch it with forgiveness. Naruto stopped, opened his fingers, and offered the palm up. Not to absolve, just to meet. The glass surged up his arm like it couldn't decide whether to swallow him whole or let him drink it. Then it drew back, as if embarrassed to have shown need. His palm throbbed. A mark tattooed itself there in a slow, red ring, threads laid under skin by hands too precise to be hands. Yorua's breath caught so soft he only heard it because the room had nothing else in it to hear. Naruto turned. "That good, bad, or thank you for playing." "Step back," Yorua said, and for once her voice had reverence in it, like the quiet before a blade kiss. She stepped to him as if approaching a skittish animal, took his wrist with fingertips that were calloused in a swordswoman's pattern, and lifted it. The red ring lay under his skin like a promise woven into flesh. "The crown has not chosen a diurnal heir in 200 years, she said. "And never one who walks the day." He wanted to ask diurnal what, exactly, meant down here. The words had roots, and roots mattered. Instead he said, I guess we'll find out. They did not get to find out in peace. The first alarm came not by horn or bell but by the way the lanterns flicked, like eyes wincing. Every head in the market tilted a fraction. The nightingale's song snapped off mid-breath. Then the second alarm came, loud and practical. A white ash apprentice ran into the square with a bright burn on his shoulder and said, Sun threads in the north tunnel. Nets. Yorua let his wrist go with an apology she didn't say and moved. Naruto moved with her. Hinata's hand brushed Rei's hair. Stay behind me, and the three of them slid out into a city's worth of tension. The north tunnel chewed them into a throat of stone and then spat them into light. The light did not belong underground. It lay along the tunnel floor in a careful rectangle, exactly 5 paces by 10. Edges crisp, as if somebody had put the sun in a box and dragged it here. Inquisitors wearing white-limbed coats in the shape of a cross between priest and butcher had spread sun silk nets across the entry hall. 2 night wolves lay tangled in them and would have been burned to bone already if not for the chalk lines the white ash elder had drawn around their feet. Muttering a prayer to something much older than prayer, the nets hissed against the chalk and didn't eat it. Yet, positions, Yorua snapped, and the words cracked clean as ice. Onyx vein figures slicked into the walls, their moonstep leaving after images that weren't after images at all but misdirections hung like bait. The nightingale started a song in a register that made Naruto's forearms prickle, not hurting. Just telling hair what to do. White ash elders lifted chalk dust like fog and made it drift toward the silk. Naruto stepped into the math of it without asking who took commands from whom. Hinata, the anchors, he said, and she had already seen them, little brass clams tucked in crevices, bellies full of sun oil. I'll cut the grids. Yorua, can you tie a brake line? He flexed his hand. The mark there warmed. Ready. She tossed him a small flat knife with a thread tied to its hilt. Cut and I'll catch. He went forward, felt the heat hum along his teeth. The boxed light licked at his boots. He threw 2 clones into it to see what the burn would be like. They evaporated at the edges, smearing out into steam. Kurama shook himself inside Naruto's chest. We do not step into that. I heard, Naruto thought, and ran along the line where shadow met light. He flicked the thread knife out and down. It wasn't a hard cut, it was a decision. The silk parted like it had been waiting for someone to call its bluff. The thread looped around the loose end on its own, alive, and snapped tight. Left anchor down, Hinata called. A talisman flared in her fingers and died when she pinched a spot only she could see. Right anchor down, came a second later. An inquisitor shouted an order and pulled a ceramic vial from his belt. He threw it at the chalk line. Naruto snapped a wind bullet at it in the same instant. The bullet and the vial met midair and smashed. Sun oil turned to glitter in a cloud instead of a gout. The glitter drifted and latched in a thin film over everything, lantern, stone, skin. Don't breathe, Hinata said uselessly, because breath is what bodies do. The nightingale shifted key, low to lower. The glitter quivered and fell, shaken loose by a sound. Humans weren't built to hear but still felt. Now, Yorua said, and she threw the thread in her palm. It slithered like a living thing around the nearest net post and tugged. The net shifted. The wolves under it rolled, took Rin's hold. No, not Rin, old name in another time. Naruto blinked and came back to here, now, and pushed. Naruto cut again. The net sagged. The wolves slid free, smoking, alive. The inquisitors panicked like men do when plans become sand. One snapped a sun bomb open and flung it at Naruto's face. Naruto didn't think. He put his marked palm up, the way he had in the mirror, not to stop, not to block, but to meet. The bomb hit his skin. Pain spidered through his arm, bright and absolute. He didn't shove the light away. He turned it, just a tiny degree, like twisting a bottle cap. The bomb's flare splashed against the ceiling, harmless as rain. Fragments of sunlight skittered down like insects and crawled away into cracks. Nice, Yorua breathed. Not sure I can do that twice, Naruto said, teeth showing. 2 inquisitors ran at him like men who had decided to die for a cause and wanted him to come along. Naruto put his shoulder toward the first, hip-checked the second, and twisted the first man's wrist hard enough to make the talisman band snap. The second tried to bring a knife up under his rib cage, Hinata's hand reached across Naruto's back and found the key point at the base of the man's thumb. The knife fell uselessly. Naruto planted a knee and drew a circle in the air with the knife Yoru lent him, then let go. The circle hung like a picture frame. When the Inquisitor passed through it, the red thread wrapped his body in 3 loops and pinned him to the wall, breath still working, heart still beating, alive because the thread had been told to bind, not kill. Consent matters, Yorua said, almost clinically, as if she were reminding herself as much as anyone. In the magic, and in the governance. Copy that, Naruto said, and cut the last grid. The vigil broke when their nets did. They left the bodies they could not carry and the tangled gear that no longer made sense, and dragged the wounded. One looked back and spat, not at Naruto but at the ground. As if the dirt itself had betrayed him. Night won't last, he hissed. Day comes, king or no. Then bring a better day, Naruto said, because he couldn't help himself. Instead of trying to bleach the world, they retreated into the tunnel in a hissing clatter of boots and scraped steel. The city exhaled. The lantern light steadied. Ray edged out from behind Hinata and stood very straight. You saved us, they said. And their voice had that shaky flatness that comes when a thing becomes true and a body isn't sure how to hold it. We owe you. No, Naruto said. No owing like that. You helped us find the door. He rubbed his palm with his thumb. The mark there felt hot and a little smug. He would have to learn its humor, or it would learn his. Yorua's eyes were not on him but on the space above him, the air. The ceiling, a place where messages passed that he could not read. The red threads in her hair lifted, like a cat's fur rising before thunder. Yorua, Hinata asked. Yorua's face, calm as a pond in winter, cracked for a heartbeat and showed the water moving under the ice. We have a worse problem. The city shifted, a note no ear could catch hitting every bone. A strip of light burned across the cavern roof, not from lantern, not from bomb, but from outside. It wrote on stone in a hand that had written on clouds and glaciers and people's hearts for longer than any of them had been alive. The words carved themselves in fire and stayed. The day will not share its sky. Naruto felt Kurama stand in his chest and set his feet. He felt Hinata breathe in, steady, calm. Her palm finding his elbow like an anchor. He felt the weight of 1,000 watching eyes and the way a hall becomes church when a people decide it is time to listen. Tenmei, Yorua said, and for the first time she spoke a name like she'd say a curse. He has 2 fragments now. He speaks through noon. Then we'd better talk louder, Naruto said, and the humor in it was not a shield. It was a signal to his own spine that it could stand straight. He turned to face the market. The bridges, the people who had waited for a king and built systems to survive without one. He did not have a speech in his mouth. He had a simple stack of facts. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, he said, not shouting, not trying to fill the cavern. The cavern would carry what needed carrying. I walk your city by your invitation. The vigil followed my steps, I'll stand in front of theirs. I won't ask you to trust me because trust isn't a word, it's something with receipts. Here's my first. Ray asked for help. I gave it. My second. I stepped into your mirror and gave it my worst on purpose. It didn't spit me out. He lifted his palm. The mark glowed for a breath, a red ring under skin, steady as a heartbeat. So here's my third, Naruto said. We make law together tonight. We fix doors. We cut nets. We don't feed on anyone who can't say yes. We don't hand our enemies our neighbors because it's easy. I'll bleed in front of you when the day comes. I'll bleed for you when it does. Yorua stepped forward, and all the threads in her hair unspooled as if they had been waiting for this breath for a century. She took one, fine and bright, held it up, and asked not with her voice but with the way her eyes softened, asking him if he had another yes in him. Naruto turned his wrist up, palm open, offer, not order. Yorua looped the thread around his wrist once. It lay against his skin like cool river metal. Then she tied a knot that wasn't a knot and would never come undone because it had nothing to do with rope. Yorua of the Vermilion Lotus, she said, voice as clean as a blade wetted on snow. Oath-bound steward to the Sanguine Crown. I will bind to your word the promises made in this city under these lamps. I will stand at your right hand and cut the lies away. People did not kneel in a city that had earned its pride by surviving. But they bowed their heads, a fraction, as if the lanterns had gone slightly lower. Dusk wolves pressed mauled ears against the stone, in acknowledgement. White ash elders knocked chalk from their fingernails, and the dust fell in little stars. Nightingales let their notes drop, and the air thinned to silence, so the oath had nowhere to go but everywhere. The light on the roof did not fade. It was not meant to. It was meant to sit there always, a scar in stone, a promise of pain. Naruto looked up at it, looked down at the people, looked at Hinata watching him with something in her eyes that made his ribs too small, and accepted the thing he had already accepted on the ridge when he jumped without asking who needed saving. Okay, he said, to Yorua, to Hinata, to Rei, to the threads and the wolves and the smiths, to the mark under his skin that ALR. Edie thought in a voice different from his. Crown or no crown, I'll do the job. Crown, Yorua said, as if correcting a child in a way even the child would be able to love later. She lifted his marked wrist and pressed it to the air. The red ring flared. The city's light drew in and then moved out like a tide, carrying with it the impression of a circlet that did not exist and yet weighed on the bones. It landed, nothing on his head, but something on his spine, a new line run through the old ones. He stood a little straighter not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. Something in the ceiling cracked. Dust fell. The light lettering burned harder in answer, as if a hand elsewhere clenched around a pen. Naruto smiled up at it, sharp and bright, not denying fear, not bowing to it. I hear you, he said. And if you want the sky to yourself, you're going to have to take it from a lot of people who are tired of being told they can't breathe. Blasphemy, someone muttered. Naruto didn't look for the voice. It was all right. There would be 100 opinions tonight and 1,000 tomorrow. He had given the first receipt. He would keep giving them until the ledger said what he wanted it to say. Hinata's hand found his back and settled there, a small warmth anchoring a very large cold. You did well, she said softly. Ask me tomorrow, he said, and didn't try to cover the way his hand shook once, quick. Like an animal shedding water. Yorua closed her eyes for a heartbeat and listened. Not to him, to the city itself, the way it breathed when danger had gone and danger was coming. Then she opened them, and the lines around her mouth had changed. Your Majesty, she said, and did not taste the word as if she had bitten into something bitter. We have to move. The Vigil saw enough to try again with a bigger light. They won't be clumsy twice. Then neither will we, Naruto said. Let's make doors they didn't think of, and a path that doesn't look like one until they fall off it. Plan on the run, Hinata said, familiar and fond. Is there another kind? Naruto grinned, and for a breath the boy he had been cut through the man, bright as torchlight. Then he was the man again. And he was already moving, not because he couldn't sit in rooms with ceremony, but because rooms burn if you leave the heat on them too long. They moved. Rei stayed pressed to Hinata's side, a shadow following a greater shadow. Yorua walked slightly ahead and slightly aside, like any good bodyguard, if bodyguards also wrote the rules with thread. Naruto didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the hallway ahead and the dark that was not empty ahead of that. Somewhere above, a man whispered to a piece of the sun and believed it whispered back. Naruto's mark ached. He flexed his hand and let the ache be a reminder. Not a wound. He had never wanted a crown. He had wanted friends safe and villagers fed and a roof that didn't leak if you fixed it right the first time. He had wanted mornings where people said good. Not because they'd been told to, but because they meant it. Now night had given him a different set of tools for the same job. He could work with that. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The Concord Oaths. They slept badly and moved anyway. Morning in the Umbral City wasn't morning at all, just a thinning of lantern light that made faces look new-boned and tired. Yorua ate a map over a stone table and pinned roots with red thread, each strand finding a point of purchase on the surface like a spiderweb learning the room. 3 calls, 3 answers, she said, palm hovering above the map. Dusk wolves at the range, they'll listen if you run with them. White ash at Forgefane, they'll listen if you talk like a contract. Onyx vein at the lower enclave, they'll listen. And if you don't blink while they try to kill you. So they listen, Naruto said. Even if the ways are rude. Rude, Yorua repeated, and allowed herself a brief, thin smile. That word can carry a lot of blood if you ask it to. Ray stood on tiptoe, trying to see the threads from the same angle Yorua did, and failed with grace. They were clean and scrubbed and wearing a too big shirt that Somio Nay had insisted on giving them. You can't attend a council in clothes with holes the size of a fist, the woman had lectured before pressing fabric into Ray's arms like a weapon. They didn't know air to put their hands in daylight people rooms, so they stuffed them into sleeves and pretended sleeves were pockets. Hinata pointed, fingertip hovering a hair above the map. Take the ridge first, it'll cut time. But the ridge catches glare if someone tilts a mirror from above. She glanced at Naruto. I can bend it if it's small. Let's not be under a big one, Naruto said. We start with the wolves. We need their noses and they're stubborn. He didn't say, and I need to prove I'm not a crown that sits in a chair while other people bleed. He didn't have to. Yorua's gaze flickered to his marked wrist for an instant and back. They went light. 2 dusk wolf scouts who looked like men until they moved, a white ash runner who carried chalk-dusted satchels and had eyes for every threshold, Yorua with her oath threads. Hinata with 2 spare veils folded like handkerchiefs in an inner pocket, Naruto with the mark under his skin throbbing a quiet measure. The city's last ladder disgorged them into a high canyon full of breath. Pines cut the sky into spears. Somewhere far off a hawk made a lazy, interested circle and decided against being brave. The white ash runner scattered a pinch of powder over the mouth of the tunnel and watched it settle. Satisfied, he touched his fingers to the rock and whispered a promise to doors. They ran. The wolves' range wasn't marked on any map, buildings weren't their architecture. Territory was. Naruto felt when he crossed into it the way you feel when a room changes temperature. The wind-up there had a teeth-on glass edge. Claw marks scored a dead tree at shoulder height. The scent of old meat and wet stone settled on the back of the tongue. They arrived at a broken bowl of land where shale slumped down toward a white trickle of water. Heat shimmered above it though the sun had not yet lifted its face fully. A shape uncoiled from shadow and became a woman with ash-gray hair braided tight against her skull, a cloak made from something's old winter. Her pupils were too round. Who steps? She said, voice like leather drawn over wood. Guests, Yorua replied, and 1 king. The woman's nostrils flared, amusement a tiny hum under her gaze. Smells like boy, smells like fight, smells like fire that knows how to stay in its pit until called. Kurama made a satisfied, starchy sound in Naruto's chest. At least one of you dogs has sense. I'm Naruto, he said. We came to run with you, if you'll have us. You bring rules on a rope. The woman asked. We've got our own, and they don't sit well in chairs. Same, Naruto said, smiling. Our rope is for snaring problems, not people. The pack slid into being, edges of movement at the rim of vision that resolved into bodies. Some half-changed. Longer teeth, wrists too flexible, some human as knives. Pups hid badly behind a fallen log and eavesdropped with naked interest. Hinata dipped her head to them. They froze, then grinned. We hunt, the alpha said. You keep up, you keep. You trip us, we bite you. Deal, Naruto said, already loosening his shoulders. But if we find a trap, I call it, not because I want to be clever in front of your pack, but because I don't like stepping on sharp things. She bared her teeth. It read as a grin if you liked a certain sort of grin. Run. They ran. The alpha set a wicked pace along the spine of the ridge, dropping without warning down gullies that became animal paths. Popping up again where the wind chewed the smell off sweaty skin and left the feel of rock. Naruto let his body remember what it knew. Angles, breath, the way he referred to land on the outside of his foot and push off with a snap so his knees didn't complain later. Hinata kept pace as if the ground itself softened under her feet. Yorua didn't even pretend to be a runner. She glided where the path allowed and cut corners with a precision that felt insulting to the idea of gravity. The wolves bracketed them, watchful and not pretending otherwise. A youth a fresh scar across his nose ranged closest to Naruto, expression somewhere between challenge and curiosity. First law, the alpha threw over her shoulder. We don't take what bleeds and begs. Second, Naruto said, not missing a beat. We don't call people prey for being smaller. Third, Hinata offered, Voice calm as a dripped line of ink, we keep the door we opened clean. 4th, Yorua murmured, with thread snap cool. We don't sign for another's crime. The Alpha's head tilted in a short, approving notch. 5th, down, she dropped. Everyone followed. The gully they hit stank Lee. A medicine cabinet and a battlefield had had a child. The white ash runner hissed through his teeth, frantic eyes cutting over the chalk lines someone had hidden under dust. Hinata's gaze went through the ground and found something buried. A tight roll of charms nailed to a stone, old ink writing the stink of sanctity and something that had nothing to do with sanctity. Vigil, she said. Sun Brand, the scar-nosed youth said. Voice small in a way that said he knew what he was admitting and hated that he was admitting it. On my cousin. Where? Naruto asked. The Alpha lifted her chin toward a scraggy choke of brush. A pup peered out from it. 8 maybe 9. Eyes too big under a thatch of hair, right shoulder wrapped in something that had been clean cloth once. The cloth smoked at the edges. The pup tried very hard not to whimper and barely failed. Naruto slowed as if approaching a skittish horse, palms empty. Can I see? He asked the pup. Then, to the Alpha. With permission. The thing burns when day rises. The Alpha said flatly. It turns fur to ash and skin to stink. We dressed it in wet grass. We thought. She stopped. Wolves weren't built for that many words between teeth. Don't touch it wrong. The white ash runner warned. You set it off. It calls its brothers. Hinata went to one knee at the gully's lip, Byakugan blossoming. She made a thoughtful, unhappy sound. They wrapped a sun line around the deltoid and threaded it under the scapula. If I cut there, she traced a shape in the air with 2 fingers, and there, I can short the flow. Do it, Naruto said. Pain, Hinata warned the pup gently. Hurts anyway, the pup said through clenched teeth, brave in a way kids shouldn't have to be. Make it smart. Hinata's hands moved like a harpist's, each touch a precise note. She didn't break the brand. She interfered with it, stepping between points in a pattern designed to have no steps, turning glare into shadow. The cloth stopped smoking. The smell of cooked meat retreated. The pup's breath went from ragged to careful. Naruto exhaled, a knot he hadn't admitted to untie loosening. The Alpha didn't exhale. She looked at him like a hunter conceding an inch she hadn't planned to. You turned a trick that was meant to end us, she said. What do you want for it? Roots, Naruto said. Your paths through the high country. And when we call for teeth, we want teeth. You'll have them, she said, because she wanted to and because he'd asked like a man who didn't think I want and what is owed are the same thing. They bound it with a simp. La ritual. Yorua cut her finger on a thread and traced a line on the Alpha's palm. The Alpha did the same on Naruto's marked wrist. The line sizzled harmlessly against the crown's seal, then sank in. The thread drinking the promise and stitching it to bone. Run back with us, the scar-nosed youth blurted, then flushed. So we can smell your breath for our stories. Naruto grinned. You want my breath to smell like swamp. You come to the next place. The next place, hit before noon when shadows were still long and kind. Forgefane sat in a scoop in the mountain where the rocks turned the color of cinders and the ground tasted like iron if you licked it as a child on a dare. The white ash called their forge a shrine when the vigil walked by and a factory when anyone else tried to price their work. It had none of the sleekness of a hidden village shop. It was heat and bellows and a system of ducts that ate smoke and spat it out clean. Half the city's ward chalk came from here, and none of it was cheap. An elder met them in the doorway with hands stained the permanent gray of a lifetime of ash. She looked at Naruto's wrist and then at his face, and her expression said, I care about your utility more than your myth. And if that sounds unromantic it's because it is. Need mass production, Naruto said without preamble. Shade charms and ash wards that shield against sun silk. Portab. La pylons if you can do it without collapsing your apprentices. Protect the supply lines and don't tell me how to teach my chalk, she said, because the language of deals works best when it's bare. What do you pay with? I prefer coin to compliments. Roots we just bought, Naruto said, nodding back toward the range. Wolf couriers with sanctuary on the run. Also a king's goodwill. Can't melt goodwill, she said. But her mouth went soft at Wolf. We can also melt other things, a woman's voice said, smooth and amused, and the heat at their backs lifted as if the forge itself had taken a polite step aside. The woman walked in with sunlight threaded into her hair like copper. She wore travel leather that pretended not to be expensive and didn't fool anyone. Behind her came a young DS man with a face like he'd swallowed a lemon and was bravely pretending it was fine. Mizukage, Yorua said, because Yorua was not given to pretending. Incognito, the woman said cheerfully, and me led like trouble that had gone to finishing school. I took a vacation. My people hate that word. Mai Terumi put her hands out toward the forge as if greeting an old friend. I heard a rumor in the mist about a boy who wears night the way my village wears fog. A boy who thinks laws should be made where blood dries, not where reasons are comfortable. Thought I'd check if the rumor had legs. Naruto blinked once. He didn't bow. He didn't not bow, either. He let the room decide how far it would bend. We're working on making them. The laws, not the legs. Mai laughed, delighted. Good answer. Then her eyes flicked to his marked wrist. Heat flared in her palm and died just as quickly. A little warning, a little hello. May I? He lifted the wrist. She didn't touch it. She held her hand a wreath above the mark and let her chakra taste the edges. She cocked her head. Lovely. Consent woven right in. Very fashionable. Non-negotiable, Naruto said. Best fashion is, Mai said, and then, without warning, her other hand came up and spat a disk of molten rock at his chest. Hinata moved first, a veil in her fingers unfolding like pulled silk, bending the flare away from Naruto's face, curving it into a kiss with the forge where it belonged. Naruto moved second, sliding half a step to the left so the disk would pass the spot his body would have been if he'd flinched instead of thinking. The white ash elder didn't move at all. She watched like she was timing bread. Mai put a hand to her own cheek, as if fanning herself. If you can't stand the heat, she said, shameless, you can't stand for anyone. Consider it a small test. I'm more worried about your aim setting the chalk dry, Naruto said, grinning. But thanks for the warm welcome. Mai's eyes sparkled approval. Acceptable. I like you, King of Night. I'll send ships to carry your chalk where it needs to go and a small detachment of shinobi who don't mind the dark so much. Her gaze slid to Hinata, reading the veil's edge, and perhaps a few researchers who'd like to see how a bending technique like that handles over water. I could see it saving fishermen from flare storms. Hinata colored, then breathed in. Dee took the compliment by setting it somewhere useful. It's crude, she said. It scatters glare but won't hold under sustained noon. Crude holds long enough, Mai said, if you put it in the right place. She tipped her head toward Naruto. You put him in the right place. That helps. Mai stayed just long enough to make 3 more jokes and one sharp observation about the way the forge vented smoke right into a blind corner someone could die in. Then she left with the swordsman who quailed at her, loved her, quailed again, and a promise to send her, unofficial courier with papers nobody would admit were binding. The white ash elder named prices without blinking. Naruto agreed without haggling because he'd come to pay what the work was worth, and they were all a little happier than they'd expected to be. They didn't get a lunch. The onyx vein enclave sat in the lower caverns where stalactites glistened like teeth and the ground kept your footfalls honest. The vein liked you to forget where your body was in space and then be reminded by pain. Lanterns burned cooler there. Sound hushed itself out of respect for knife whispers. They were met at the threshold by a man who wore shadow as if it were tailored to him. He had a face you might not remember the first time, elegant in a way that made memory slide off, and a smile that said he would remember you forever, especially if you bled well. He bowed in a way dancers bow when they intend you to fall in love with their bow. Prince Kajhisa, Yorua said with the mild dislike of a woman forced to speak in a stranger's court. We come to exchange courtesies. Quote, you come to collect votes, he said, and shrugged, generous. Which is a courtesy, if you've got a talent for it. We admire talent here. His eyes landed on Naruto like a hand polishing a sword. And new things. We've always admired new things. Can't promise I'm new, Naruto said. I break and fix and run my mouth and break again. Kajhisa's smile widened by a tooth. Consistency. Even better. Come, king, have tea. Try not to die. They drank something darker than tea out of cups more delicate than sense would advise. With the first sip, Naruto's Ngue went numb and then came back drunk on flavor. Kajhisa asked questions that weren't questions. What he thought of inheritance, of permission, of hunger harnessed as cleverness. Naruto answered Lee. A man who had dug a ditch with his hands and knew a ditch is just a long question you ask the earth with a shovel. Kajhisa clapped once, soft. We should work together, he said. You with your daylight manners and that lovely ring. Me with my expertise in the parts of the night you'll never see because you are a good man. That sounds like a threat disguised as a compliment, Naruto said amicably. Why not both? Kajhisa's eyes went bright with private joy. Now, your welcome gift. The ceiling moved. It was not actually the ceiling. It was three men in shadow skin, already falling. Naruto didn't look up. Looking up would put his body where their blades wanted it to be. He moved sideways, his marked wrist humming. Not warning, not command, just attention tightening like a knot. The world tugged at his ankles, a slight, off-hand invitation. Borrowed. The crown murmured without words, a cool hand on heat. Naruto stepped into the shade of Kajhisa's sleeve and came out 5 paces to the left. It was not just fast. It was wrong, a shortcut through a place that had agreed to be path only for the length of a heartbeat. Moonstep. The assassins. Blades kissed air where his neck had been and bit nothing. Hinata. Who did not borrow, did not borrow. She refuted. She ducked, spun, and touched 2 men in 4 places with a sequence that closed their arms like bad doors. Yorua didn't move at all until she did. Then 3 threads flicked, and 3 wrists were tied to 3 pillars as if they had always been there. Kajhisa slowed a clap he had begun before the attack started, laying. Thenning it into something like a fan fold. Acceptable, he said, as if evaluating a jug he was thinking of purchasing. The crown plays with you. It plays with us, Naruto said, and let the passive hang in the air like a warning. Not just me, not just you, us, remember the rest of the sentence. And it burns when it's bored. Kajhisa's lashes lowered just enough to register thought. We can give you what you want, he said finally. Our step, our blades, our people, if you give us back what the daylight stole, the freedom to cull. No, Naruto said, simple and flat. We're not going back to grabbing throats because it's easy. Not with me in the room. I thought you might say that. Kajhisa rose, face carefully neutral. Still, welcome to the night, your majesty. It gets brighter the longer you stare. I'll have my vote couriered to your steward. He slid his gaze to Yorua, enjoyed the way her shoulders went stonier when he said steward, and returned to Naruto as if bestowing attention. Do try to keep breathing. Naruto spread his hands, smiling because that was a better use of his mouth than spitting. We'll breathe, Prince. Might even teach you how, one day. They left with no blades in their backs and a promise on paper that smelled faintly of old blood. Outside the enclave, Naruto had to lean a shoulder into the stone and let the world turn once without him. You moved through me, Kajhisa's voice said inside his head, except it wasn't Kajhisa's voice, it was the crown wearing his timbre like a borrowed coat. That is rare and costly. Don't ask for it twice today. Not planning to, Naruto thought back, the old banter with Kurama making room for a new companion. The fox grumbled at being demoted from only passenger with opinions, then yawned and sprawled across Naruto's ribs, unbothered. They didn't get the luxury of later. Later turned into a message running from a dusk wolf's mouth in little pieces between breaths. Vigil. Black sight. White tents with no shadow. Taking. Children. Sensors. Marks. Quote. The map in Yorua's hands flexed. She laid thread in 3 quick strokes. The lines hissed and became a root. Move, Naruto said. The black sight sat where the land gave up on being soil and tried being rock again. White tent fabric rejected the wind. Talismans hung in tidy rows like teeth in a skull. The vigil had learned from last time. The sun silk nets were anchored by plates that exhaled light. The corners were braced with chalk lines that weren't chalk. The white-limbed coats moved in squares and triangles, always checking corners first, nerves held taut in professionally tidy arcs. Count, Hinata murmured. 8 on the perimeter, 2 with tags that smell like command. 3 inside the central tent. 1 prisoner. Big coil, mid-level chakra reserve, Uzumaki swirl, Naruto. He didn't hear her for a beat after Uzumaki. Sometimes a word arrives not as meaning but as a blow. Not a person, but a wound you forgot was yours. Family, he said, very quiet. Could be, Hinata said. She didn't add. The chakra feels like a scream waiting in a throat, like a rumpus room locked from the inside. She didn't have to plan, Yorua said, too brisk to be unkind. Now, Hinata, can you make a tunnel? Naruto asked. 2 breaths wide, low, straight into the main tent, a little left. Can bend glare to buy us a line, she said. But once they see it, they'll flood it. I just need a breath and a half, he said. He looked at Yorua. Can you ghost the anchor threads? Not cut. Mute. Yorua lifted a single brow, offense and interest winding like twin vines. Yes. Wolves take the far line, bite at the ankles, make noise. White ash. Dust the plates. Sneeze on them if you have to. We go in fast and leave with one person. Do not engage anyone you don't have to. I'll play idiot if someone needs to be a distraction. You're very good at that, Yorua said, deadpan. Thank you, he said with a little bow. Worst case scenario, we break the tent and run. Best case, we ghost the tent and walk. Walk, Hinata repeated, as if trying the word in a size bigger. Okay, on you. They moved in the kind of sync you don't teach well in rooms. The wolves exploded on the far side, whooping the way people who have been denied noise too long like to whoop. White ash dust lifted in sheets and rolled toward the plates, landing in a film that turned light into something like milk. Hinata put both hands up and pulled the glare sideways. It bunched obediently, just 10 inches at first, then more, a shivering ribbon of wrongness that ran from their shaw. Dow lined straight under the main tent flap like an unrolled mat. The world beyond it wobbled and then stabilized, a narrow gray corridor cut between white light. Go, Hinata said through her teeth, breath thin. Naruto went. Inside the tent, he found a woman in a chair that had been made to be a trap long before it had held a human. Chains draped her calves and arms in a mockery of jewelry. Her hair, red as a switchblade drawing, was matted to her face with sweat. She glared at him like he had personally knocked her down. That better be a rescue, she said, voice gone hoarse and feral, NTH. And she shouldered her chains in a move that would have been a headbutt if he'd been taller. When the chain connecting her wrists to the floor caught the leg of the chair slammed into his shin. He just managed not to yelp. Name, Naruto said. Karen, she snapped. Ooze. She bit off the last 2 syllables out of habit, then watched his face like she could see the word rising anyway. Hi, cousin, Naruto said. Because sometimes the shortest line between 2 points is the one that acknowledges the bridge already exists. He drew a kunai and went to work on the cuff nearest his hand. Karen rocked her weight, and the chain caught him across the jaw. It hurt with the ringing clarity of aluminum hitting bone. He blinked tears out of reflex. You're terrible at letting people help you, Naruto said, rubbing his jaw. You're terrible at being quiet, Karen shot back. Which is worse in a tent like this? Yorua slid in behind him like a shadow you only notice when it takes pity and lets you. Her thread kissed the lock and turned half a degree. The cuff sprang open with the wounded dignity of something that had pretended to be stronger than it was for too long. You're pretty, Karen told Yorua, dazed and mean. Because pain makes people say things sideways. And you smell like promises. Yorua gave her a look that was both flattered and unimpressed. Naruto, the plates. He ooped the ankle chain and braced his heel against the floor for leverage. Karen's hand snapped like a striking snake and caught his wrist. Wait, she said. You want to keep the wallpaper? Naruto asked. Do you bleed easy? She asked him, eyes already glassy with the wrong kind of heat. He didn't move his wrist out of her grip. He turned his hand palm up. Not if you're asking nicely, he said, tone measured. Yes if you're not. Those are the rules. She blinked. Something rerouted behind her eyes. I'm asking, she said, and then, because honesty is a blade that cuts both ways, please. He sighed a little. Make it quick. She leaned in. It was not romantic and not monstrous. It was practical and ruthless. A small bite, pressure, a pull that returned color to her mouth even as it took it from his. The marks on her wrist stopped bleeding like a river and started like a song. Your chakra tastes like a thunderstorm, Karen said, breathless, drunk on the way living feels when it stops feeling like dying. Like if I lick a battery and a pine tree at the same time. Don't lick trees, Naruto said. They're innocent. Not the ones that fall on me, she muttered, but her hands were streaked. Edie when she grabbed the chain and helped. Let's go break something. They stepped back into the line of bent glare exactly as it collapsed. Hinata staggered, caught her balance. An Inquisitor ducked into the tent with a talisman burning like a flat sun in his palm and took in two things, the prisoner standing and the mark on Naruto's wrist. He tried, to his credit. He threw the talisman and added his weight behind it, planning to ride it through and break 3 bodies on the way out. Naruto stepped into him rather than away. He caught the man's wrist in both hands and didn't fight the talisman. He invited it. He turned it half an inch like twisting the cap off a hot jar. The flare shot past his ear and stitched a neat hole in the tent wall. Someone screamed outside. Leave, Naruto said, nose to nose with the Inquisitor. You're not ready. Not for us. Not for people with rules. The man smashed his own head forward on instinct, a professional saving reflex. Naruto let it hit his forehead, the better part of courtesy. It hurt. He didn't drop the wrist until Yorua's thread kissed it and told it a different story. They ran without looking like running. White ash dust clung to the IR boots and turned every step into a tame sun. The wolves made a din that sounded exactly like a pack announcing to the world that the world had not killed their pups. When the vigil tried to regroup in their tidy squares, they found their corners smudged. Karen stumbled once, then again when the ground decided to be taller than her foot expected. Naruto caught her elbow and didn't say you okay. He said, you hungry or just pretending you're not? Both, she said, and grinned all teeth. Where are we taking me? Home, he said. She did not cry. He did. Not where anyone could see. They hit T. He rivermouth by dusk and took the stepping stones Hinata pointed out as if she had put them there herself. The shrine sat tucked into a fold in the cliff above, shallow, old, stubborn. Prayer ribbons hung in clumps that had absorbed the weather for a century and still thought they had a say about everything. The priestess stood in the water up to her shins, robes hitched, hair braided in a severe line down her back. She held paper seals like she could hold a line in the tide with paper alone, and maybe she could. Shion, Hinata said, low. Shion's gaze took in the mark on Naruto's wrist, the thread on Yorua's fingers. The blood on Karen's mouth. She didn't look away. Turn around, she said. Take the crown back to where you dug it up and seal it better. You don't know what you invite. Hi, Naruto said, because manners matter. We just stole a prisoner out of a bad tent. I'm not telling you what to think about my jewelry. But I'm asking you to let us pass. No, Shion said, and the word rang off the cliffs. No to blood becoming law. No to night naming itself king. You think you're building a refuge. You are building a throne. You don't know what a man becomes when people decide his word is clean. Naruto didn't argue doctrine. He rarely did. He raised his chin toward the river mouth. 2 small faces were there, peeking over a rock, pupils huge, shoulders bird sharp. Child. Ren who had run until their bones rattled. He tilted his head. Look. Shion's eyes cut that way. She held very still for a long breath. Then, without looking back, she lifted her right hand and flicked 2 seals. The seals rose and settled on the approaching rope of vigil boats like dragonflies choosing reeds. They didn't burn. They bound. The oars, the throats. The vigil men found themselves silently drifting backward, hands and mouths in a truce written by someone who believed in truce more than victory. We don't have to like the same things to hate the same worst thing, Shion said. Go. I won't say yes, but I won't be your wall today. Thank you, Naruto said. He didn't push more grace than he'd been given. He didn't yet have the right. They moved into the trees while the seals held and used the terrain like knives. Karen staggered less or pretended better. Hinata's breath rasped once and steadied. Yorua inspected the sky as if it had started lying. They were almost to the city and the vigil's answer rolled over the hills, an ache made of light. It didn't come like sun does, from everywhere and above. It came like a spear thrown from a tower. The head of it was a lens, a shimmering, ugly thing that hung from a scaffold bolted to a cart. Men in tan pulled the cart. Inquisitors walked alongside, each with a second lens strapped to their chests, all pointed inward toward the heart. The heart spit noon. The trees around the wagon had bleached to memory. Grass lay flat under a glue of heat. Everything in a 10-pace cone ahead of the projector was white, not because it was white but because color had been asked to leave. Down, Hinata said, and through her veil. It wasn't big enough. It bent the first cut of light to the side, took the hard edge and made it a curved slap, gave all of them one breath. Naruto used the breath how he always used gifts. He shoved it into the place where he wanted a door. Thread, he told Yorua, and she was already looping 2 lines into his fingers, one meant to hold, one meant to remember. Wind, he told himself, and Kurama answered with a rolling growl that was not gentleness and not brutality, just power deciding to be a tool. He shoved chakra into the spin. Not the way he had done 1,000 times, but a different way, thinking about the way blood moves when it listens to a heart and the way oaths sit in people's mouths and make them choose. The sphere didn't howl, it purred. It glowed the color of a bruise seen through skin, red not as rash but as resolve. Crimson, he said to the name trying to be born. Better than sentimental, the fox said, indulgent. He lunged. The projector flung a solid rope of noon at his chest. He didn't block it. He shaped around it, let it slide over him the way a river slides around a ROCK that refuses to admit a river is bigger. The Rasengan sang in his palm, and the threads arced out from it like tiny comets, each one touching the light and taking from it a little, remembering the pulse, the cadence, the way it fell. He drove the sphere into the lens. It didn't shatter the lens the way you break glass. It unwound it. The lens was just light caught in the habit of being a circle, and the habit forgot itself. Noon spilled harmlessly. The projector coughed and told the men hauling it that it was tired and wanted to sit down for a month. Inquisitors shouted and threw. Hinata's veil crouched over the ground like a turtle shell. The light ran off it and turned into a smear instead of a spike. Yorua's thread stitched the smear's edge and made it snag on itself. The wolves leaped into the side corridors the light left and emerged behind the cart with their teeth bared and their tails high, laughing like things that have decided to be alive on purpose. Karen grabbed Naruto's elbow and yanked him right as a secondary lens fired. He felt the heat of its shaved hair off his forearm. You owe me, she said, breathless and grinning. I'll name a school after you, he said. Too much, she said. Name a sandwich. Deal. They broke the projector in 3 places that were all places. The lens, the habit, the idea of it. The men pulling the cart fled, not because they were cowards, but because the thing they had been told would keep them safe had just folded like bad laundry. Naruto stood in the ruin of the projector's shadow and looked at the white scar it had dragged across the field. He could feel the judgment of Tenmei's message still burned into the city's ceiling above, even through earth and tree and hillside. He could feel the attention turning their way from beyond the hill, a hotter, more precise watching. It had the feel of someone who thinks he's in charge of daylight and has offended someone else has turned a lamp. Listen, Naruto said, breath sawing, voice steady anyway. He wasn't making law yet, he was announcing gravity. We don't hide, we make law. It starts now. No feeding without consent, no taking children, no easy prey, no secret kill rooms. If you scare our neighbors, you answer to me. If our neighbors try to erase you to make their own lives clean, they answer to me. Who made you king? A vigil man wheezed, choking on dust and pride. I did, Naruto said, and glanced at Yorua, and she did, and they did. He jerked his chin at the wolves, the white ash, Hinata, Karen, and anyone else who wants to sign their name to a world where we don't have to pick between cages. Quote, he didn't shout, not to the vigil, not to the wolves, not to the trees. He freed his voice into the air like he'd cut a thread and let it fly. The wolves howled once, not triumph, a signal. The white ash runner lifted a chalk-smeared hand in acknowledgement. Yorua tied 2 threads together and made a small knot that changed the temperature of the air. Hinata smiled, tiny and entirely private, looking at him like a man she loved might become the one she already thinks he is, if he keeps doing this exact thing until he can't breathe. Karen leaned on his shoulder shamelessly and looked at the broken projector with greedy interest. Can I keep a piece? She asked. I want to chew on it. Not in your mouth, he said. You'll get light splinters. I'll get light splinters, she repeated. Delighted. What a stupid world. Let's make a smarter one, Naruto said. A bell rang from far off. Not a bell, a resonance. It shivered through the hem of his CL. Oken ran bone to bone before sliding away toward the horizon like a rat heading home to bad news. Yorua's eyes narrowed in a squint that wasn't about light. That is not a local noise. Not a projector, Hinata said, Byakugan lifting. She sifted the distance and winced. Bigger. They stood on the broken field and watched the sky burn a line they could not fully see. The line wasn't a message, it was a map. The map bent and then unbent, as if something enormous had rolled over in its sleep. Naruto waited for Kurama's hiss. It came. They're building an engine, the fox said, disgust curling its voice. Make Noon portable, drag it around, show it off like a scar. Son Hero, Yorua said, the words bitter on her tongue. Old plans pulled off old shelves. Karen made a face like someone had said homework. Can we just break it before I finish being rescued? Naruto breathed in, breathed out. The crown under his skin stretched, amused at his impatience, respectful of it anyway. He looked at Hinata. She tilted her head, the form of a nod she used when she was listening to a problem's hips, not its mouth. We can try, he said. But first we make the oaths real. No point bringing Tao, and something that big if the world we land it in can't stand up. Concord, Yorua said, rolling the word like wine on her tongue. I'll draft it, you'll speak it, and they'll sign or they'll show the IR teeth and we'll know where to put the doors. They walked back to the city with the projector's bones creaking in the wind behind them. Children ran out from under the stalls when they arrived and did that sideways hover kids do before deciding if a person is safe. Ray, who had made it back fast because their feet already knew the way, landed on Karen like a hawk and then pretended they hadn't because they had a reputation to uphold. Who's the loud one? Ray demanded, eyes narrow with interest. Your new favorite person, Karen said, baring her teeth. Obviously, Yorua didn't even try to pull the city into a hall. She did it in the market, because markets are better at law than halls a surprising percentage of the time. She set up a table that wasn't a table, just a plank on barrels. And spilled thread across it like a river at flood. The threads found names in the air and looped them. White ash elders signed with a thumbprint in chalk and a word in an old alphabet that smelled like crushed bone. Dusk wolves signed by pressing the pads of their fingers into the thread until it tasted them. Nightingales sang a line and cut it into the thread with a note you could only hear if you needed to. Naruto didn't speak until the lines had made a net that wasn't a net and the sound in the square had gone friendly quiet. Then he spoke the 3 rules again. Consent, no prey, no secret. Kill rooms, because law is repetition with purpose until it becomes habit, and habit is the point. People argued. Of course they did. One woman wanted a clause about trading blood for service with teeth so sharp you could shave with them. A white ash elder shook his head until his ears flapped and then argued her around to a position that kept the grinders but lost the edges. A dusk wolf wanted key. LL writes back for a hunter who'd broken a taboo in the hills. Naruto said no, then offered a path through apology that didn't taste like capitulation. A nightingale wanted protection for artists Becca. Use some ritualists thought songs were optional. Yorua tapped the table and said, cool, try fighting without your ears. Karen sat with her boots on the edge of a stall and watched it like a play. Sometimes she threw in a line. Usually cruel and correct. Hinata murmured with a white ash apprentice about the angle of light in narrow alleys and how to make it trippia without making it murdery. Ray fell asleep against a rope and drooled a little, which embarrassed them when they woke and did not embarrass Hinata, who wiped the drool with maternal efficiency and pretended not to notice Ray's proud horror. By night, the first layer of the accords lay on the table like a cloth. Naruto signed by laying his marked wrist over the heart of the weave. The thread hissed and sank in, the way water. Accept stone if stone is the right shape. Yorua tied a knot that would hold tolerance and resist fear and hum when someone tried to grind it apart. Everyone exhaled, some grudgingly, some as if the why had been holding their breath for 200 years. It did not solve hunger. It did not solve hate. It did not brush the ceiling clean. It built a door. Later, when the thread had been put to bed, ND children were hauled out from under benches by the ankles and adults pretended they hadn't cried if they had. Naruto stood on a balcony with Hinata and watched lanterns drift. The light cut the cavern air into thicknesses. The ceiling scar still burned. "You okay?" she asked. "Ask me tomorrow," he said, the line repeated this time with a tired affection that turned it into more than a joke. She stood close without leaning. An art she had perfected. "Karen. Good trouble," he said. "Like a storm that washes the dust off and ruins 3 roofs." "She's family," Hinata said, and the word meant more because it had always meant more to her. He nodded. "Shein. Afraid in the right direction," Hinata said. "It's better than zeal pointing the other way." He laughed once, low. "May. Dangerous," Hinata said, dry. "And helpful. Possibly offended by how handsome you are." "Good thing I can't stand heat," Naruto said, and Hinata's laugh was quiet and warm and made the balcony a small island in a good sea. Yorua appeared at the door like a thought. "Your Majesty," she said. "We have a location on the Sun Harrow's last seen trajectory. If we interrupt early, we can force it into a maintenance posture. If we don't, they may drive it into the basin and paint a noon we can't outwalk." Naruto looked at the ceiling. The words were still there. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. "We're not waiting for better light," he said. "We go." He turned to Hinata. He didn't say be careful. He didn't say I need you. He said, you take lead on glare. I'll aim low. No heroics, just right hits. Right hits, she repeated, and met his eyes with hers until the promises didn't need thread. Karen leaned on the balcony rail from the far end, eavesdropping with cheerful shamelessness. "If we're breaking another machine," she said, "I get to chew a piece and you name a sandwich." "You're very focused," Naruto said. "I like goals," Karen said. Yorua stepped forward. For once, she didn't preface with a plan. She handed Naruto a coil of thread and let it pool in his palm. "You will need this," she said, "to tie a decision to its consequence." He looked at the thread, at his wrist, at the city that had decided to try breathing by rules that didn't require anyone to pretend to be less than they were. He squeezed the coil gently, and it squeezed back. "Okay," he said, and he smiled the kind of SMI that had always gotten him into trouble and, lately, started getting other people out of it. Let's go ruin their new toy. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Harrow at noon. They met in a room with no walls. The white ash had thrown a tarp between 2 wind-twisted junipers and called it a map tent. The tarp flapped and made the drawn lines look like things that breathed. Beyond it the desert was a pan of sun, and the heat rose in a visible shimmer that ate detail at its edges. Karen knelt over a chalk circle, eyes half closed, palm on the sand. Sweat shined on her cheekbones and didn't seem to notice it was supposed to sting. "Its heartbeat fast," she murmured. "Not like a machine, like a ritual that forgot it was a prayer and learned to walk." "Sun Harrow," the white ash elder said, unhappy but professionally impressed. "Anchors at the corners, load-bearing oaths at the midpoints. If you break the anchors first, light spills. If you break the oaths first, it screams and calls home." "Nightingales?" Naruto asked. A woman with a line of paint across her cheeks dipped her head. "We can lay hush to cover the first 3 minutes, she said. "Not more unless we want to lose voices for a week." 3 is enough, Naruto said. He looked at Hinata. "Veil. I've been practicing," Hinata said, like a shy boast. She held up a length of cloth she'd stitched with fine lines of chakra windings, not talismans, not seals. Just the memory of how light behaves when asked politely. It'll bend glare into a tunnel. Small, narrow, but it will hold if no one insists on noon. Mei Terumi arrived late and theatrical. Wind in her hair like a decision, travel dust on her shoulders like an accessory. 3 mist shinobi trailed her, all of them walking like professionals who planned to earn their pay with the minimum number of mistakes. The swordsman from the forge, a lemon trying to be a person, flanked her and tried to look less besotted. "Apologies," Mei said cheerfully, taking the tarp's wavering edge between 2 fingers and steadying it as if that would fix the whole situation. "I was discussing logistics with a caravan master who thinks shade is a rumor. We came to terms. What are we breaking? An engine that pulls noon around like a donkey," Naruto said. "We need you to boil the braces without turning the passengers to soup." Mei's eyes lit. Delicious challenge. She glanced at the chalk. "Yorua, Yorua had been quiet, looking at the desert the way a fencer looks at a room, counting corners, measuring echoes. I'll take the oaths that hold the cages, she said. I won't sever them. I'll reword them, briefly. So the cages open to anyone who asks nicely. Karen snorted. Your, nicely, and mine are not the same. That's because yours usually begins with a headbutt, Yorua said without looking over. Affectionate as a knife. A dusk wolf we'd run with in the range ghosted into the tarp's shade, gray hair darker with sweat. He didn't waste time with greetings. We smelled glare from a ridge 2 valleys away. He said. Big. Structures moving. Not fast, but sure. They lay down noon in strips, like a plow eats a field. Naruto nodded, the plan threading itself in his head. The knots forming where they needed to. 3 teams. Wolves and nightingales, you keep the perimeter messy and polite. White Ash, you dust the load plates I call out. Hinata, you keep the corridor open for as long as you like me. May, melt the braces when I say, now, and not before. Yorua, unsay the cages. I'll draw Tenmei's attention and prevent him from turning me into a lesson about hubris. I like that plan, May said. Except the last sentence. It lacks detail. I'll fill it with improvisation, Naruto said. May smiled like a cat that had discovered a new kind of cream. My favorite ingredient. Shion walked in from the sun and made the tarp dim by existing. Her robes were dusted to the knee, and her hair stuck damply to her neck. She looked at Naruto and didn't bother with preambles. If you open this thing wrong, light spills into the river basin, she said. Every shrine within a day's walk will wake up mean. We're not opening it, Naruto said. We're stopping it and easing the light back into the sky. You can't ease a sun that's been tied like a horse, Shion said, but her mouth twitched at easing. Too human a word for the scale of what they were doing. You can if you ask nicely, Yorua said. And Shion gave her a look that said she wanted to disagree but also wanted that to be true. Shion took a sealed strip from her sleeve and held it out. Radiant anchor, she said. Temporary. Bind it to something that wants to stay. It'll make light remember it is only light. Naruto took the seal, surprised by the cool. Thank you. You're going to do it anyway, Shion said. Putting it someplace in herself that would be useful later. I prefer this to apology. They went at noon, because there's a particular joy in choosing the hour your enemy thinks belongs to him. The desert cracked and lifted. Dunes like slow ocean. The sun harrow moved along the basin floor like a temple that had stood up on rails. The heart of it was a lens the size of a house, its face a flat round hate. 8 pylons bracketed it like ribs, each shivering with contained glare. Below, cages, many, the kind that made a noise in the throat when someone saw them and decided the no. Eyes should not come out where kids could hear it. Karen swallowed and set her palm to the sand again. Pulses every 8 heartbeats, she said. When it breathes out, we move. When it breathes in, we pretend to be rocks. So, Naruto said, breathe like a thief. The nightingale began a song that killed echo and left only purpose. Sound went thin. Their footsteps made no conversation with the ground. Hinata lifted the veil, her hands calm, the cloth unfolding and becoming an idea wrapped around space. The glare ahead of them blinked and believed it didn't need to be here for a while. Between glare and glare, a corridor unspooled. They went in a bent line like the movement of a snake, embracing wrongness because it got them home. Wolves arrowed outward and split, yips layered under the hush like a code. White ash dust lifted into a fog that played nice with shade. May lifted her palm, made a tiny volcano in her hand, then closed it, pleased by the grip she had on the melt. Yorua's threads floated near her fingers. Serious as writing. Naruto reached the first pylon and felt it in his teeth, a high clean whine that made the back of his head itch. He laid his palm to the post. The arc under his skin crawled like a spider deciding whether it liked him. Anchor, he muttered, eyeing the joint at the base. If light is weight in a frame, what's the nail? Hinata touched the steel, with 2 fingers and found the tenketsu of a machine. Here and here, she said, and he nodded, hand already moving. He cut. Not metal, habit. The pylon shuddered and bent toward its own shadow. The GHT it held gathered for a breath in a pearl, confused, and then slid back into the lens where it belonged. Karen blew out a breath she'd been holding without knowing she was holding it. 1 down, she said. 7 to ruin. The second gave them a bruise. A flanking inquisitor found their hush with the edge of his boot and dropped a talisman that spat a sheet of white over the corridor like paint. Hinata pivoted, pulled at the veil, bent the sheet. It fought her. She got it to a curve and held it with both hands, and something in her shoulders Naruto didn't like seeing, strain in a place that shouldn't have to hold strain alone. I've got you, he said. Not reassurance. Logistics. She didn't say I know. She leaned harder into her craft and made the light lean with her. They took 3 pylons quick and dirty. The 4th had a cage hung beside it as if it had been chosen to make them slow down and think about their souls. Yorua's mouth went thin. They wrote a rule on the door, she said. It says, open on noon when the King of Night begs. Rude, Naruto said, voice flat to keep what it wanted to do behind his teeth. Can you misread it? Yorua's thread slipped into the seam between door and idea. We learned this from men who thought law was a circle they could draw around their throats and call it necklace, she said softly. The thread twitched, the knot reset. It now ds. Open when anyone with a pulse asks politely. Naruto put his fingers on the handle and asked politely. The door opened. Inside, 5 bodies where there should have been 10, all breathing the way cheap clocks pretend to. Shion moved like a blade through cloth, seals already in her hands, not to burn but to bind. She tapped a seal to a girl's sternum and the girl's eyes opened, then closed. Hen opened again properly as if the world's brightness had been turned down to a bearable setting. Move them, Shion said. The wolves took 2 each, gentle as if lifting pups. Karen staggered under he awkward weight and complained about it to no one in particular while not setting anyone down. That was when Tenmei decided to be present. He did not walk in. The light changed, and there he was in the space where light had been. Like noon had put on a man. He wore armor that wasn't armor, a lattice of plates that drank glare and spit it back. His hair brightened at the edges as if the sun had ate a crown and then forgotten to be subtle about it. His eyes were not unkind. That might have been the worst thing about them. You do everything loudly, he said to Naruto, conversational. I should appreciate it. The day has so many whispers, and you are an air in the lungs. Thanks, Naruto said. I try to be good for breath. Abomination, an inquisitor hissed beside Tenmei, voice small and brave. Tenmei didn't rebuke him. He didn't encourage him either. What do you tell yourself? Tenmei asked, curious more than cruel, when you tie darkness to law. That I've seen what your version of light does to children. Naruto said. Tenmei's mouth tilted, disappointed and old. I don't have a version. I have a principle. Day reveals. Night hides. We are not scorched by noon. We are healed by it. He lifted his hand. It was not a big gesture. Naruto's mark went white hot as if a wire had been shoved directly into blood. He heard himself make a sound and hated it, not because it was weakness, but because it would worry Hinata. Hinata was already on him. Palm over palm, left hand at the base of his thumb and right hand 2 inches above his wrist, touching him in places that changed how the brand sat against his bones. The pain didn't run away. It stopped running and stood still. That was enough. Son Mark, Tenmei said mildly, like a teacher admiring a student project that had turned out better than expected. The heat climbing Naruto's arm braided itself around his forearm, shallow under skin but deep enough to make his breath stutter. Gift. Proof. There aren't many who can carry it and stay themselves. Quote. Naruto laughed once, because it was either that or bite his tongue through. That's supposed to make me smile. Because it's not working. I would prefer you think, Tenmei said. He moved his gaze from Naruto to Hinata, and his eyes softened with something like gratitude. She was hurting, too, anyone could see it. Hyuga Eris. Lovely technique. Spare your hands. He cannot hold day and night both. Watch me, Hinata said. She pressed harder. The flare in Naruto's forearm found a rhythm it could not bully and had to match or be extinguished. It chose to match, out of stubbornness if nothing else. Naruto could breathe again. Not well enough. Assignments, he said, or tried to. His tongue felt too large. He put the plan in the air anyway. May, braces on my 3 when I say. Yorua, cages, wolves, pull and bite. Ash, Dust the heart when it chokes. Hinata. Keep me between light and you. You're an idiot, she said softly. I do it professionally, he said. Tenmei's hand lifted again, and a column came down. It was not light, it was well-given architecture. It pinned Naruto at the center and pressed him a step toward the floor. Kurama snarled, the old sound of a thing that had been trapped too long to be patient with trapping again. Up, Kit, yeah, Naruto thought, and went up into pain like a swimmer breaking water, only water was fire. He took the column with both hands and stood under it. He'd learned how to stand under something a long time ago. He split. 3 Narutos ran, 2 left and 1 right. Tenmei's eyes snagged on the R.I. because that one bled a little from a cut across the cheek. It was Naruto and it was not. It carried heat and weight and the ridiculous vitality of a body that refuses to admit a mortal coil is supposed to be mortal. A blood shadow clone, the crown's trick tangled up with his own. Sensors would feel it. Tenmei did. He followed, because he was smart and because smart men make mistakes when song. Eating insults their sense of what should be real. Naruto's real body cut left under the bracket while the column held only him now, not Tenmei's attention. Mei, Naruto said. Now, she said, and lifted her palms. Her lava didn't gush, it lipped. It slid like honey and barefoot pain along the brace seams, then licked into the bolt holes and sat there thinking mean thoughts. Metal sagged. Heat load shifted. The heart of Sun Hero tilted 3 degrees. If you'd been a surveyor you would have nodded crisply and put it on your diagram. If you were a giant lens full of light you did not admire the survey, you wobbled and spilled. Yorua's threads cut the cages at the joints language uses when it pretends to be fair. Doors loosened. Bolts forgot to lock. Hinges chose to squeal in the right register so wolves heard them and came to chew. Karen planted her feet, lifted her hand, and drew herself a map. The Harrow's pulse was wild now, like a horse that sensed its rider wasn't looking. She grinned at it with dangerous Uzumaki delight. There, she said to no one and everyone. There you choke. White ash dust rose and flowed, milky and patient, easing over a seam that was not made to be seen but had always been. The lens coughed. Its noon stuttered. Tenmei realized the wrong Naruto was wrong and cut him through the stomach with a blade of white so quick the clone didn't have time to be dramatic about it. It folded, but the blood that spilled held shape and steam for a second longer than most illusions should. Tenmei's mouth pulled in something like reluctant amusement. Then his gaze snapped back to the center. Naruto breathed once and stepped out from under the column. He was slower than he wanted and less handsome than he liked, but his hands were steady. He palmed a Rasengan, not the kind that screams. A small one, tight, whispering. He put in wind and oath thread, blood memory and fox spark, and then he cooled it until it was a bead that ate sound and did not break air. Hinata's fingers tightened around his wrist for one breath, not to stop him. To say I'm here, answer or not. He moved. The Harrow's heart was a circle pretending to be a thing. He gave it a smaller circle to flirt with. And when the big circle leaned down to admire itself, he pulled the small one back and let the big circle fall into the empty. Sound went out like a candle. For a second everything held as if the world were a photograph waiting on its chemical bath. Then the heart imploded. Not glass shattering, glass remembering sand and deciding it missed it. The noon lurching forward rolled back over itself and poured into the sky in a ragged cough. Somebody screamed. Not a vigil, a nightingale, cut through by a snapback beam that found the one place Hinata's veil couldn't bend. The singer's song went into silence mid-note, and it put a hole in the hush that would be the size of a person for a very long time. Mei swore like someone throwing a table out a window and ran toward the sound she couldn't fix. A mist shinobi caught her elbow without catching her, professionals all the way down, keeping a cage from making herself into a poem about grief. Xian's seals ran like water, by Nding a spill that wanted to become flood. She didn't look at Naruto. She didn't need him to see her to do her job. Tenmei landed lightly on the tilting platform and watched the light spill without rage. He looked at Naruto the way a man looks at a painting he's loved since he was a child and has suddenly realized is about to belong to someone else. You could have killed 100 captives, he said. You tried not to. I don't like making new ghosts, Naruto said, and if the words caught on his tongue against a name, Neji, they did so quietly. What you call ghosts, Tenmei said, I call cured darkness. I call that convenient, Naruto said. He flexed his hand and the brand flared, angry and beautiful. You mark children with that convenience. You build poems out of other people's pain and call it noon. I'd rather be rude. I am making a world where the wrong kind of power can't hide, Tenmei said mildly. The light around him thickened and thinned as if it enjoyed the sound of him. You are building a city that needs shadows to breathe. Naruto thought, fleeting, of the market under foxfire lamps where a kid named Ray had finally slept without a sun bomb waiting for them at the door. We're building a world where people can turn their faces toward morning without being erased to make it easier for you to see. Tenmei smiled like sorrow learning a new instrument. We will do this again, he said. When I am holding more day and you are holding more night, and we will see whose arms are tired first. 2 coils of light, thin as ropes, dropped from the open sky and settled in his hands. Fragments. One bright with a brass taste, one sweet and cruel like citrus rind. He tied them at his belt the way a man ties a handkerchief. The harrow's ladder of glare blew its last breath and died. He looked up. The air above him made a hole that did not line up with any cloud. Next time, he said, not to Naruto, not to anyone, bring an honest dawn. Then he kicked off air and went up, light carrying him like a favor. Naruto didn't chase, couldn't, even if the stupid part of him wanted to. He stood in a hot wind that smelled like metal and almonds and counted 3 beats before he let his shoulders drop. Status, he said, voice hoarse and hard enough that everyone answered without deciding to. Cages open, Yorua said, threads still looping. 22 alive, 6 beyond us, 1 nightingale down, wolves, Naruto called. A howl, ragged and proud. The dusk wolf Alpha, herself this time, appeared in human shape with 1 ear burned at the tip. Teeth intact, she said. 1 pup under, he'll live if the night lets him. White ash, singed, the elder said dryly, already counting in his head. And underpaid. May, Naruto asked, because she deserved to be asked like anyone else in a fight. We're fine, May said, and if fine arrived in a voice that had detonated mountains and then apologized to them afterward, no one mocked it. She touched the forehead of the D.E.A.D. Nightingale with 2 fingers and then her own. Her shinobi fell into a neat perimeter and began pretending this had been a conventional skirmish. Sometimes pretending helps. Shion walked over with her sleeves rolled and little loops of hair stuck to her cheeks. She looked at Naruto like she had been angry at him since morning and was willing to table it for the afternoon. You didn't pretend to a miracle, she said. You chose the small right. It cost you a big glory, but people breathe. Good, Naruto said. Glory chokes. He leaned on his thighs and let Kurama seethe through his blood. Until the brand's heat felt like a humming wire instead of a knife. Hinata's hand sat on his shoulder until the humming learned a shape it could keep without argument. He wanted to put his forehead against her collarbone and let the world go away for 20 breaths. He could have admitted that desire. He did not indulge it. He stood up. Listen, he said to the bodies that could hear him and the ons that couldn't but would have wanted to. He didn't climb anything. He didn't lift his arms. He spoke where he stood and let the desert do the carrying. We are not a surprise anymore, he said. Tenmei has fragments. He will come again with better angles. We can't just win fights. We have to make it so there's something to come back to that's worth it. He pointed with his chin toward the cages. Law here. Now. Same 3 as last night. Same teeth. No feeding without consent. No prey. No secret kill rooms. Add 2. We keep corridors for prisoners and patrols with mixed teams, night and day under a shared oath. So nobody's story goes untold when someone tries to throw a match and call it sunshine. Shion inclined her head, the smallest acceptance. I can bind patrol oaths with radiant seals. That don't burn unless someone lies to them, she said. They will not ask your people to kneel to my doctrine. They will ask them to be brave in the direction of care. I like that, Naruto said. Yorua's thread touched his wrist. He did not look at it. He didn't need to. He could feel consent write itself along the line of his arm where law lives in a person's body when it's real. Blood banks, said the White Ash Elder. Practical as a ledger. If we're doing consent, we're doing infrastructure. I'll draft schedules, you draft teeth. Karen, sitting on a crate because her knees had decided to be human again, raised 2 fingers. I'm building a nasty list of vigil tent designs, she said. Give me a handful of genin with nose and a ruler and I'll make the black sites blush. May wiped her palm on her hip and gave Naruto a long, measuring look. You gave orders that didn't make you the whole weather, she said. I'm more inclined to believe in you when you're competent than when you're legendary. That's my whole orientation, Naruto said, dazed honest. Flatterer, May said, without smiling. Then, mist patrols will run with your wolves if your wolves promise not to pee on the gunnels. The Alpha considered ritual purity in the context of boats and shrugged. We can make concessions. Shion stepped close enough to smell the scorched cotton smell of his jacket and the weird sweetness of brand heat. I misjudged you, she said, the words not a surrender but the kind of apology that wants to work, not be admired. Not about the crown. About you. I'm not the crown, Naruto said. You are if you fall. She said. It wasn't a threat, it was a diagnosis. Do not make me fight the thing I admire because it got tired. He nodded. Keep yelling when I'm stupid. Gladly, she said, and walked away to argue with a mist shinobi about where seals look nicest on a spear haft. Naruto gave orders until his tongue felt heavy. He sat with the families of the people they'd pulled out and didn't say they're safe now. He said, do you want water? And, do you want the loud redhead to stop trying to steal the cart? And, yes, the wolves are safe to touch. Don't pull tails. He took a strip of cloth from his pocket and tied it around his wrist over the brand because the air on it made the muscle chatter like a thing that had been working in cold too long. When the words, tea of it had become paperwork and repacking, he walked up the hill alone and then not alone because Hinata's steps matched his without trying. Show me, she said quietly. He turned his wrist and unwrapped the cloth and let her look. The sun mark lay under his skin like gold leaf hammered into a spiral. It wasn't beautiful, it was precise. Her Byakugan opened and traced its filaments into his elbow where they insisted on straying. You can carry it, she said. But not in open day without spinning yourself down to nothing. Good thing I'm an indoor kid now, he said, Rye. It's hot. She placed her fingertips along the wrist bones and then the forearm and applied the smallest pressure in 3 spots. It rerouted the burn in a way that made his shoulders go loose and his jaw unlock. He almost dropped. Her hand slid from his wrist to his palm and stayed there, skin to skin, longer than a technique had any interest in. He didn't break the contact. Neither did she. Thank you, he said, "'Cause when a person keeps you from becoming a cautionary tale you say that. You did the same, she said, eyes flicking in the direction of the nightingale's body, and what she meant was you recognized your limit and chose cost. And that was a different kind of saving. They stood like that until the wind changed and brought with it a smell that hadn't been in the desert a moment ago. Wet stone, rotted rope, salt. Naruto's vision narrowed. The world went gray at the edges, not black. He did not pass out. He passed through. The crown reached up inside him and pulled his attention toward something older than the idea of noon. He could see it like you can see a thing you've never seen and still know it. A vault under a ruined island, red and green lights moving like breath, a sigil etched on R. Ock the same way the brand had etched into his arm but older, kinder. The shape of a lock. The sense of a gate. The whisper of a name he knew without being taught. Uzushio, home of the people who made seals into language and language into homes. In the vision, threads hung like vines and touched water. The water glowed. The glow tasted like stars. Hinata's fingers felt very far away and very close. Naruto, she asked, soft, not pulling him back, guiding him there and here at once. Uzushio, he said, voice raw. There's a cradle. The knight's cradle. The crown. It's a key. Or a lid. Tenmei's fragments. If he forces a son, he'll try to use the gate. Hinata didn't ask what gate. She breathed out once. We go. He laughed once, helpless, the joy and fear braided as tight as rope. You haven't asked if this is a hallucination. You've never been boring, she said. If it's a hallucination, it's a useful one. He looked at the basin where people were rebuilding their day. He looked at the sky, clean now but used hard. He looked at his hand in hers. We finish here, he said. We name roads and patrols and rules like we mean to come home to them. Then we go, later, under a tent that did not need to be there but was. Because sometimes shelter is for the mind and not the skin, Naruto wrote names into the accords. Yorua tied the net in the only knot she ever used for law and never used for anything else. She pressed 2 seals into the weave and made it glow the way light does when it falls through leaves. May signed with a flourish and a dry joke about needing a better pen. The dusk wolf alpha bit the thread and the thread purred because it liked a good bite. Naruto didn't sleep. He lay on his back and let the crown run its cool fingers over the burn while Kurama ran his hot ones the other way. He thought about Neji's grave and the way a man can teach you how to choose a life even by turning his body into a wall. He thought about the nightingale's silence and decided to build a school that taught kids to sing and survive. He thought about Uzushio's underwater vault and wanted to run until his lungs were mistakes and then run some more. He did not run. The sun had set. It would rise. Between those things, a person could make enough choices to matter. Dawn came like a debt paid slowly. They took everything they needed to build a trip and nothing they didn't. May F'd with a sideways salute and a promise to send sailors who liked gossip and weren't afraid of vampires. Shein traveled light, because everything she needed to carry lived in the place between breath in and breath out. Yorua left the city in the hands of a second who could speak to threads without being told how and kissed Rei on the crown of their head like she had always had that right and always would. Hinata adjusted the wrap on Naruto's wrist and met his eyes. No speech, no thread, just a question made of trust. He nodded. Let's go find the lock, he said, and then, because he was Lear Ning to be the kind of king who didn't have to make a new vow every time he opened his mouth, he smiled and added, and keep it closed or open it right. They turned their faces east and walked toward a ruined island that had been waiting for them since before anyone wrote the word waiting. Behind them, the city breathed by the rules they had made under a broken machine's shadow. Ahead of them, the sea thought about storms. Above them, the sky pretended it didn't care. It does that. Chapter 3 end. Chapter 4. The Cradle and the Knife. The sea had grown out of patience with itself. It heaved under the hull as if remembering a fight from a long time ago, and all the waves wanted a rematch. The skiff cut between slow-shouldered swells, Mist Shinobi on the oars and a wolf crouched at the prow with pupils blown wide to drink the gray. Naruto stood near the bow, wrist unwrapped, letting salt air draw a thin sting across the sun mark. Hinata's fingers moved sure and careful, setting a fresh band. Age like a ribbon on a gift he hadn't asked for. Too tight, she asked without looking up. Just right, he said, and the words carried gratitude and tired in equal parts. May leaned against the gun ale in the way of a person who'd studied leaning in complicated rooms and applied it everywhere. You do realize, she said cheerfully, that the last time anyone sailed for Uzushio because a dream told them to, it ended very dramatically. Quote, wasn't a dream, Naruto said. More of a all-hands memo. From May prompted. The crown, he said. And something under it. Shein sat cross-legged beneath the mast, sleeves rolled. Inked seals laid to dry on a board across her knees. The charts said this channel closed a generation ago, she said to no one in particular. The water doesn't read. Water reads moods, Yorua said. Gaze on the horizon, red threads at her temple lifting and laying. It opens where it wants to be held. Karen, hair still uneven from the rescue haircut cutting chains and trimming bangs with the same knife had not produced a salon finish, squinted into the mist. Also it stinks like old rope, she said. Which is very nostalgic and also I might puke. You may not puke, the mist swordsman said. Green around the gills in a heroic, dignified way. We are all very brave. That's not how bodies work, Karen muttered, then grinned, pleased with herself and miserable. The skiff slid through a seam in the fog and Uzushio rose from the water like a memory's spine. Black ribs of drowned docks, the ghost of a tower leaning as if embarrassed by its own insistence on still being there, gulls in ragged, hopeful loops. The big whirlpools slept, as if someone had whispered to them and they'd agreed to wait. The wolf at the prow stood up, smelt the air, nodded. Door, he said, and pointed where no door was. Naruto saw it a breath later. The water lay wrong for 20 paces, a soft dip instead of a crest, the sea suddenly shy. He turned his marked hand palm down and pressed. An old habit of knocking where you weren't sure if anyone lived. Threads prickled along his wrist like a polite shiver. Here, he said. The skiff slid into a cove that had no business being a cove. White ash lanterns, old, drowned, and stubborn, glowed on the walls like foxfire trapped in glass. A shallow stair carved into limestone went down, not up. You shocked, May observed to the dead island at large, appreciative. Good bones. Terrible plumbing. They tied off. Naruto stepped onto stone that remembered what it was like to be part of a country and felt his lungs open in a way that had nothing to do with air. The crown inside him came awake without his permission or protest, like a cat recognizing a room. We're not alone, Hinata said quietly, Byakugan blooming. Signatures, old and not shaped, not moving, one moving, small living or small problem? Naruto asked. Both, Hinata said, and smiled a little, because that was the sort of place Uzushiya was. They climbed to a square of broken brick choked with seagrass and rope. People had been there recently. Footprints in wet grit, a string of prayer flags pinned with fish bones, a pot of stew cooling on a tripod, steam a faint ribbon. A dozen fishermen's boats bobbed just beyond the cove mouth. Lanterns winked, not code, comfort. A man with a beard like a cliff and hands like anchors raised a ladle in greeting. You the ones making law for the night? He called. Trying, Naruto said. Good, the man said. Got 3 kids on my boat who didn't sleep in a year because of sun men under the docks. They slept. He shrugged. If you're lying, lie like that more. The fisherman gestured toward the seawall where someone had rigged a line of paper lamps from a splintered mast to a broken rigging post. In their soft light, faces showed. A knot of day folk and night folk mixed together with the variety of people who have decided to dine anyway. A white ash scholar sat cross-legged on an upturned crate, showing a pair of children how to grind chalk without choking on it. The nightingales had set up a stringed instrument that didn't mind sea air and were testing a chord that sounded like moon on water. It wasn't a festival, it was the beginning of one, the way evenings test how far from grief you can step without losing respect. Somebody pushed a cup into Naruto's hand before he knew he wanted it. Hinata got a bowl of soup, eyebrows rising despite herself. May stole the lemon wedge from her swordsman's drink and bit into it with pleasure that made his day. Yorua stood a pace to Naruto's left and a half pace behind. Like a steward and like a blade. The threads at her temple lifted, then stilled. Watch the rooflines, she said softly. Always, Naruto said, and then, because trust is an action. He turned to the crate where the white ash scholar had set his chalk. Master Oribe, he said, recognizing the slope-shouldered man's hands and the way his thumbs had learned to smooth a bisect line into perfect thirds. Thank you for coming. Oribe lifted tired, clever eyes. Your accords are interesting, he said, which from a white ash scholar was, I'm impressed, with the decimals left in. If you want a city to stand, you build a ledger before you build a wall. Eat, May advised him, dropping a hunk of bread into his cup. I prefer my bureaucrats saltier but alive. A small hand tugged Naruto's sleeve. Ray, in a shirt that fit better and a smear of stew across their chin, said, I told them you were loud. They meant it as a compliment. Trying to be good for breath, Naruto said. And Ray nodded like that was obvious. The nightingales plucked something brave and tender. People leaned closer to their bowls. The sea sighed, pleased to be part of a story instead of the whole one. Naruto drank, let the heat settle his stomach, and was just turning to ask Oribe if the brickwork along the eastern face carried the kind of weight you keep, when a thread of light cut the space between Oribe's hand and his throat. It was so clean it made no sound. For a blink it was just a neat line where a line didn't belong, like a child had drawn a razor on air. Oribe's eyes widened. He lifted his hand to the chalk as if to finish a line. Then he fell. Everything stopped pretending it wasn't a fight. Hinata moved first without moving much at all. She shifted so Ray was behind her, bowl abandoned. Palm already lifting for a veil. Yorua's threads flared, found angles. The wolves under the rigging went from men to something that remembered that ears are a weapon. The second needle came for Naruto's eye and met red thread halfway. It kinked and burned, a whine like an angry insect. Yorua's fingers barely moved, apology and war in one motion. Roofline, she said, and the word carried 3 coordinates. Onyx, Naruto said, and the taste of the word was old ink and fresh blood. A silhouette stepped out of shadow on the ruined tower. Prince Kachisa, dressed like a rumor of an assassination. Smile like coin flipped to decide a life. What a happy coincidence, he called, voice smooth and carrying. We came to pay respects to the cradle and found a party. How modern. A ripple moved along the broken wall. Not one body but many. Onyx vein forms slid into visibility, not hiding anymore. Some crouched, some hung from old ropes like spiders considering a fly that wanted to be eaten. Kachisa leapt light-footed to a salt glass catwalk, one of the white ash's old bridges, fused from brine and crushed sand. Thin, treacherously strong, clear enough to reflect a person back at themselves. He walked its spine easily. The lantern light made the glass a river of gold, the sea below smashed itself soft against the rocks. White ash scholars are always so precise, Kachisa said, looking down at Oribe with the regret of a man disappointed by a broken instrument. It's a pity his precision tried to make new law. Some of us prefer the old ones. Night takes, day wakes, debts paid in throats. Who killed him? Naruto asked. Kachisa's smile did not widen. You're going to say I did, which will be useful for your narrative. I will say your reforms let the day into our halls and sowed confusion. We can test both propositions, if you like. This is my city, Naruto said, and the sea, which does not bow, bent the smallest degree to the claim. We don't kill scholars to prove points. Kachisa's head tilted, interested. Ah, my, that's the part that will save or break you. He lifted his hand. Trial by combat then, your majesty. Old law, salt glass and moon. Winner writes the song. Loser goes out with the tide. Yorua stepped half forward, threads flaring. You don't set terms in our court. I set theater, Kachisa said pleasantly. A different kind of thread. Besides, your people want it. They're hungry and they want a story to digest before they go to sleep. Give them a clean one. May's voice drifted up lazy and lethal. We could also drop the catwalk. And let the sea find out whether your bones float. Kachisa didn't look at her and thereby demonstrated either respect or folly. Your Majesty, he prompted Naruto. Oribe's hand still touched chalk. The line he'd been drawing had smudged against the wood, he'd meant to finish it. Naruto knelt, breath tight. He took the chalk between his fingers and completed the line, a curve that connected the ledger's margin to its logic. It made his throat hurt. He stood. Trial by combat, he said. Under a moon that isn't full. Heads tilted toward the sky. The moon was a bite out of itself, the right size to make shadows ask questions. Good. Yorua's mouth tightened. Not disapproval, calculation. No one bleeds this city's law out in a private vendetta, she said. Win clean. Bind him to the bridge. So everyone can see what he tried to make us. Naruto stepped onto the salt glass. The surface flexed the smallest fraction. The sea below clawed at rock and pretended not to watch. Kachisa opened with a shallow cut that wasn't a cut. A horizontal flick meant to make Naruto show his block. Naruto didn't. He let it go wide by exactly a hair, reading the distance the way you read someone's handwrit. Ingen know whether they hate their father. Kachisa's eyes warmed. Ah, you can dance. Naruto moved forward on the balls of his feet, weight light, a fighter who understands that distance is a promise you make and break. The mark under his skin sizzled as salt wind licked it. He didn't let it into his head. He shaped breath like the sea. In, out, the steady kind that makes cliffs. Kachisa vanished, edged from in front of him and became a knife point behind. Moonstep. Naruto didn't try to trace the step. He stepped with it, letting the world be wrong for the length of a blink, came out 2 paces to the left. And caught Kachisa's wrist as if catching a thrown apple. Gentle, firm, a pressure that asked the blade to inspect the far air. Kachisa flowed, bone water silk. They traded small harms. Kag. Ahisa scored a line across Naruto's bicep that hissed when salt found it. Naruto hooked a kick into Kachisa's calf that sent a tremor up his thigh and into his balance. Both learned things. Under them, the glass sighed. A child on the seawall stood too close to the edge. Naruto kept one eye on Kachisa and one on the edge, which is exactly how you get cut. It is also exactly how you keep being the man you say you are. Eyes on me, Kachisa crooned, amused. Or fall. Offer me something worth the full attention, Naruto said, and flicked a feint that looked like a fumble but was the beginning of a tie. Yorui's thread hummed on the far side of the bridge, catching the angle, waiting. Kachisa saw the thread at the last second and did a clever, ugly thing. He drove his blade straight into Naruto's branded shoulder. Pain flared white, staggering. Hinata's foot hit stone on the seawall, wanting to go, stopping, trusting him. Naruto didn't jerk away. He let the steel go in just far enough. Then he put his palm against Kachisa's chest and shoved exactly once. Not big, not dramatic, enough. Kachisa slid back, blade pulling free, smile all teeth. Trading blood, he said. Not what I expected. What did you expect? Naruto asked through his teeth. Mercy, Kachisa said, and the way he said it turned the word into mockery. Naruto stepped forward and made the shape of a mistake. He overreached with his right hand. The marked one, as if offering Kachisa a kill. Kachisa took it, beautifully, instinctively, the way a thief takes an open purse. He stepped where Naruto needed him to step. His shadow fell long and wrong. Yorua flicked 2 fingers. A red thread sang. It hit the shadow where shadow anchored the man. Not body. Intent. It looped once, twice, thrice, and tied. Cage. Hisa stopped moving the way a deer stops when it realizes the fence is barbed and already in its hide. He could still breathe. He could still talk. He could still lift the knife and look at Naruto like offense married admiration. He couldn't step. The shadow held him to the bridge as neatly as a scholar pins thought to page. A sound rolled across the seawall. Not cheers. Relief. The kind that lets other sounds happen again. Children forgetting to be quiet. Wolves letting their shoulders drop. Fishermen taking a breath deep enough to feel like supper. Kachisa's eyes were bright. You used law to cheat, he said, delighted. I used law to stop you making a rule with a corpse, Naruto said. He put his hand on the blade in his shoulder and pulled it out, slow, not to show off but to remind his own muscles whose body it was. Blood ran warm down his arm and soaked the wrap. Hinata hissed without sound. Kachisa flicked the knife in his hand once, wrist elegant. How will you end it? Cut my throat and make a cleaner song. Spare me and make a complicated one. Complicated, Naruto said. You wanted an old trial. Here's an old sentence. Exile from our laws. You don't walk our doors. You don't sit under our lamps. If you breach that oath, your shadow answers to us before you can. Kachisa's smile turned lazy. You can exile me from the room. Can you exile me from the night? We're writing the night, Naruto said. Try and see. He lifted his marked wrist. Yorui's thread tugged like a pulse. Between them they tied 2 knots in a promise. Kachisa's shadow fluttered, breathed, went still. Naruto stepped back off the bridge carefully. The catwalk flexed, comfortable again with just one stubborn man on it. Until next time, Your Majesty, Kachisa said, lowering his lashes in a courtier's pledge that meant nothing and too much. May your new world break as politely as you wish it to. He dissolved into the dark like ink in rinse water, taking his men with him, leaving only tea. He lingering taste of old power annoyed at not having dinner. Naruto stood, blood running and breath even. Hinata came to his side and pressed her palm to the wound. The veil arts turned gentle, the bee. Leading slowed as if it wanted to please her. Hospital later, May announced briskly, as if she ran one and would accept no backtalk. Crown first. Shion knelt by Oribe. She closed his eyes with 2 fingers, then touched the chalk. He finished the line, she said, seeing it and letting it matter. We'll write the accords on salt stone and let the tide read them. Yorui's hand found Naruto's wrist briefly. Legitimacy, she said, the way a person says the name of a child born breech and strong. You earned it the way it could be kept. They went down into Uzushio at dusk, in a procession of laws and losses and small good food in paper bowls. The entry lay under the tower's barefoot foundation, through a door that wasn't set into a wall but into a line of water. Shion hummed a scaled tea made the surface still long enough for them to step through without drowning. The stairs were not stairs but a slope carved to persuade feet. The walls had been sealed, literally, by people who'd loved the craft enough to make the joke. Vines of thread hung, old and tired and very awake, coral red and the color of deep leaves. The air cooled, then cooled the right way, not sea cave clammy but library calm. They came to a chamber shaped like the inside of a bell. In the floor sat a pool shallow enough to lie down in and not drown unless you meant to. In its center rose a pedestal with no top. Around the rim, carvings, not letters. Exactly, but their grandparents. Naruto's body knew what to do before his mouth put words to it. Kneel, breathe, open his hands, let the crown lay itself across his chest like a cloth. Don't lock the door because you're afraid, Kurama rumbled inside him. Don't open it because you're proud. Balance, balance, Naruto thought back. We've been studying. Start. Yorua said to no one in the room, and the threads around her wrist relaxed as if relieved to be where they belonged. They didn't convene a class. They breathed. That was the trick of the Nocturne Sage. No smoke, no pose. No ceremony. Just the art of doing one thing without flinching when the world tried to convince you of 10. Naruto closed his eyes and found the starfields under the lids. The specks that always exist when you stand up too fast or look too long at sun and then into dark, those. He listened to them, not with ears. With the place rage lives when it isn't busy and the place love goes when it needs a chair. The sun mark burned, a stubborn child poking. He didn't crush it. He invited it into the quiet like you invite a loud uncle to dinner and hand him a job slicing Brea. So he has to sit still and cut straight. The first breath felt like salt dragged over a wound. The second had a sound in it, tied over stones. The third had space. He went still, not empty, not statue. Still like a field in winter getting ready. The room shifted around him, and it wasn't the room that changed. The world's volume turned down. The pain in his shoulder recorded itself and then agreed to stop shouting. Kurama settled, grumbling like content fire. When Naruto opened his eyes again, edges were softer but clearer, less glare, more line. Pretty, May said, and he realized there was a glow in his skin that wasn't light but notice, the way you mark a page for later with the heat of your palm. Hinata's eyes shone as if she were looking at him through a cloth of midnight that chose tea. Oh, show her what she needed to see and nothing that would clutter that. Nocturne, Yorua said, pleased as a smith with a bell that rings true. Sage on the shoulder and the tongue. Karen made a face. If I sit still I disappear. She complained, even as she folded down to do it, even as her eyes widened because the hum in her bones changed key and settled into the thread of everything Uzumaki shaped under the floor. Okay, fine, I'm starlit. It's gross. Shion walked the carvings the way a blind woman reads a face by wanting to know it. She pressed her palms to one figure, a circle with a line through its mouth. Purification misused as just erasure, she murmured. These aren't prayers. They're warnings to people like me. People like you are the reason places like this get to rest, Naruto said without looking away from the water. You just prefer the window open. Her mouth tugged. I prefer kitchens that aren't full of smoke and old gods choking on praise. But yes, they trained. Until training stopped being a word that meant drills and became a word that meant an agreement between body and idea. Naruto practiced catching the flare of the mark between two breaths and putting it where it bothered him less. Hinata bent light with smaller and smaller gestures until the veil learned to be a whisper, not a shout. Yorua re-wove two of the room's tired threads, fingers so gentle the old magic didn't bristle. Karen mapped the vault with her palm and her mouth, calling out the places it needed to be touched like a singer tuning a hall. May tried to sit and made it 2 breaths. Before her shinobi coughed accidentally on purpose at her, which made her sit 3 more out of spite. Hideous, she reported, and effective. Later, when the practice had become the kind of quiet you don't want to break with noise. Naruto drifted nearer the pedestal without meaning to. It had looked like nothing. It wasn't. He could feel a lock nestled into nothingness, the way you can feel a knot through a pocket. Complicated and old, there were more carvings along the pedestal's throat. Shion traced them with 2 fingers. Pictures of a sun eating a field. People trying to swallow it back and choking. Then another kind of people, the kind with shadows too long at noon, stepping between and biting the sun's edge until it bled back into dawn. Otsutsuki, she said softly, giving the old enemy a new pronunciation without reverence. Not a god, a farmer with a torch too large for his field. The crown's a lock, Naruto said, reading the shape without reading the tongue. And a lid. It can open a gate or keep it shut. Both, Yorua said, expression gone still in the way that meant the calculus in her wrist had found a variable it respected. A hinge if the hands are right. A seal if the hands are not. That's what made them make rules about who wears it. They did not trust themselves. Does anybody? Mei said, almost gently. Naruto touched the pedestal with his good hand. The crown inside him reached out. Brushed the lock. He pulled back. He did not test doors because a room was interesting. He measured rooms, then chose if they needed to be changed. Hungry? Hinata asked, voice small but not simple. You burned a lot. He had not planned to ask. He had planned to lie to his own body until it shut up. It was not a good plan, and she had always been rudely competent at seeing what plans he was about to make and making better ones available. Yes, he said, and the word felt like a country you don't brag about visiting. She stepped close, far enough from the room's eyes to give the moment a wall. Close enough to not pretend it wasn't in a room. She lifted her chin and offered the curve of her wrist. Calm. No drama. The light was bad and kind. The water flickered. Consent, she said, not as a joke and not as theater. Mine. He hesitated because hunger, when faced, can mistake reverence for fear and turn both into appetite. He waited one breath, two, and in those breaths he remembered why she mattered and that she was not a meal. Then he set his mouth to her skin and bit carefully. It was not sex and not a sacrament. It was a very human exchange in a old room that had seen all the names people give each other. Her pulse touched his tongue. The mark cooled. His shoulders settled. She swayed the tiniest bit because bodies like to agree. He held her elbow. Present in the catching and in the letting go. Okay, she asked when it was done and he had stepped back because it was supposed to be. Okay, he said, a little breathless. She pressed her thumb to the marks to stop them, thinking they had a chance at being dramatic. You taste like pine again, she said, almost smiling. You taste like a person, he said, and she laughed, quietly shocked. Because the line had landed where he meant it. Karen cleared her throat loudly from nowhere and everywhere. You're very romantic, she announced. And there's a door open where a door shouldn't be. There isn't, Yorua said. Already turning. I would know. Then there's a hole, Karen said, already running. Come on. They reached the far side of the chamber in the same breath and found no door, no hole. They found a reflection. A piece of the pool's surface that didn't behave. It didn't mirror, it mocked. Light quivered on it like nerves. Karen, Shion said sharply. Karen's hand was already up. It's buzz sweet, she said. Like burnt sugar. Like. The reflection bulged. A hand came out, all light and plates, a policeman's glove made out of noon. It caught Karen around the wrist and pulled. Naruto hit the surface with both hands, too late by a breath. The pool took him in forearms deep and allowed pain to run up his brand for fun. The hand yanked Karen into the light the way a fish is yanked into air, wrong. Gasping, furious, Karen, Naruto said, not loud, just louder than everything. He grabbed her free arm. The light burned him through water. Yorua threw 3 threads at once. They sizzled on sunshine and died. Hinata diverted glare, bent the wrongness, it slithered. Mei hurled a fist-sized heat into the reflection, it adjusted and laughed in colors only seals hear. Tenmei stepped into the room without stepping. His face hung inside the reflection at a strange angle, as if the pool were a window tilted wrong and he didn't notice because he was busy being a man with an idea. I told you, he said to Naruto, gentle. Bring an honest dawn. You bring an honest apology, Naruto said, teeth bared, and pulled. The light burned deeper. The mark went white. His ones thought about quitting and then remembered they worked for him. Karen looked at him with an expression that had belonged to her since she was born. Don't you dare blame yourself for what you can't stand not doing. She took a breath like a diver. Find me, she said, the tone delivering 3 instructions. Don't die, make a sandwich, burn their tents. Promise, he said. Promise, she said, and let go of him. The light swallowed her like a mouth that had been waiting. The reflection snapped flat. The water caught a tremor and then pretended to be bored. Naruto stayed where he was for a heartbeat, arms in a pool. Hands full of nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't hit the floor. He pulled his arms out, water running like a joke, and stood. The room breathed wrong for a long, held second. Then the mark on his wrist flashed and a line drew itself in the air. Not words, not a map any sane shipmaster would use, just a thin, unwavering promise from pool to ceiling and out through stone, pointing. Hinata closed her eyes and followed it with her Byakugan until the line made sense. Up, she said, then east. The air bends over a place that floats where it shouldn't. A temple, a ziggurat on hot wind. Sky steps, Yorua said, harsh with anger and awe. He's making ladders for noon. Mei spat something in mist and then translated for the children in the room. He's very rude. Shion touched Naruto's elbow. Her hand was steady. Go. I'll hold this place. If the lock tries to turn, I'll sit on it singing until you come back. You believe in us now, Naruto said. Shion's mouth did. A pained little concession that in any other person would have been a grin. I believe in the work of people who don't like glory but do it anyway. He nodded. He turned to Yorua. Oaths, he said, and she was already tying 2 threads. 3. Binding coalition and direction and freedom into a braid that would pull people toward the same fight. Wolves on the ridges, Yorua said, voice clean. Nightingales spread the hush. White ash, shade pylons. Mei, boats and sky hooks. Hyuga, pierce the conduits. Naruto, lead and do not try to be every wall. Copy, Naruto said. He looked at the pool and carvings in the cradle of a knight meant to be balance, not bludgeon. He looked at the place where Karen had been and would be. He looked at Hinata, steady as a door that opens and closes and makes a house something worth living in. Your Majesty, Yorua said, and there was no theater in it, just a title she used when Speed needed to wear respect. The sky just made a promise. He smiled, not beautifully, not heroically, but like a man who had decided the day was going to get very complicated and he would love it anyway. Then we'll keep it together, he said, and reached for the thread she offered like a handle on a door that led out and up. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. Eclipse of the Sun. The sky turned to hammered brass and forgot how to breathe. They came up out of the cradle into a wind that smelled like hot rope and salt-scorched gulls. White ash shade pylons rode on mist skiffs like big-bellied beetles, their chalked ribs creaking as sailors eased them toward the reef. Dusk wolves loped the ridge lines, tongues out, shoulders rolling in a predator's economy. Nightingales took positions along the cut of the cliffs, raising their instruments and tasting the air for resonance. Shish. Ion moved through the bustle like a pin through cloth, sliding radiant seals into the gaps no one else could see. Yorua stood where stone met ship, hands behind her back, threads at her temple lifted like whiskers sensing a storm. Listen, she said, and people did, the way they listen at a river right before they decide where to cross. We've 8 minutes after the hush starts before the temple learns the pitch and sings over us. Wolves, run messages on the outer ring, use the side gullies, not the spine. Mist, anchor the pylons when His Majesty's hand goes up, not before. Nightingale, hold T. He lower register until you taste your teeth, then let the upper in slow. Ash, sweep the plates as soon as the braces droop. Hyuga, pierce the conduits. Priestess Shion, bind on my count, release on his. Her chin flicked toward Naruto without a flourish. He didn't climb anything. He walked the length of the rock and let the wind eat his words so they'd carry wide. Same rules as always, he said. Help first, then clever. If you can throw a knife at a problem or ask it to move and you choose the knife, make sure it deserved it. We talk across the lines. If we break forward. If we can't, we fall to the pylons and choke the light until the temple chews its own tongue. Mei sauntered up at that exact moment, hair like a threat, smile like a plan. And if anyone sees my swordsman trying to duel a metaphor, she added. Trip him politely. He's in love with mistakes. Yes, Mizukage, the swordsman said, cheeks already pink from the sun and from existing near her. Hinata wound the saint strip of cloth around Naruto's forearm and tied it with fingers that had less tremor than he deserved. She set her palm to the mark and found the 3 pressure points that taught the brand to listen. When the burn settled into a hum, she let go. You're handsome in twilight, she said softly. Good, he said, I'm carrying some with me. He lifted his hand. The crown answered. It wasn't a cloak and it wasn't armor. It was an agreement inked onto his skin in a slow rush. The cool just after sunset gathered under his nails and across his knuckles, crawled his forearms and climbed behind his ribs. He inhaled, and the air went easier. He exhaled, and the wind leaned away like a dog offering the bone it had meant to bury. The ring of twilight spread from him in a slim, steady band, no more than 3 paces across. Daylight flowed around it like water around a rock that knows its job. When he walked, it walked with him. Diurnal form, Yorua said, marking the term with the same care she'd used to tie it. Not immunity, courtesy. Then we'll be polite within our boundaries, Naruto said, and his smile tilted reckless. The floating temple, ziggurat on hot wind, impossible and insulting Why elegant, dragged a noon with it big enough to erase gull shadows. It walked the air on 3 vast pylons of light. Ramps of glare spilled down like tongue, then drew back. Sometimes a shape crossed those ramps, human at a distance. Inhuman when the eye returned to it. Karen was up there. He could feel it in the jitter of his blood. Uzumaki bodies all hum a little at the edge of the world, hers was. The out-of-tune hum that made the best songs because you had to listen harder. Nightingale voices dropped the hush. Sound smoothed. The cliff lost its echo. Boots and paws became ideas instead of noises. The temple didn't notice. It breathed out light and inhaled it again, a smug, ugly rhythm. Hinata unfurled her veil. It became not a sheet but a rumor, a suggestion that Glare should go have a drink somewhere else. Naruto stepped into the temple's light and the twilight moved with him like an oath. The first ramp tried to peel him. He held his ground. He asked the light to find someone else to bully. It pressed harder. He raised his marked hand and turned the pressure a quarter degree like he was loosening a stubborn jar. The glare slipped aside in a controlled spill and streaked the air, while the chalked white ash pylons drank it with restrained greed. Now, he said, and mist sailors heaved as one. The pylons thumped into sockets carved into the rock just for them a generation ago. By people who had guessed this day might come and been right. Chalk dust puffed, runes caught, shade rose, small and stubborn as mushrooms. The temple noticed. Lines of noon crisscrossed in the sky, adjusting. A dozen vigil brigadiers stood along the rim in their tidy coats and raised talismans like priests holding up doctrine. The ramps tightened into beams. Light dropped in verticals designed to nail men and wolves and chalk to the earth. Upper, nightingales sang, and the hush's tenor climbed. The beams vibrated. They didn't stop. They stuttered, like the temple had developed a stammer. White ash swept their plates, fanning dust with wide brushes and caps held tight to heads. The dust found the seams in the glare and settled like a film that told the light it had bad skin. With every sweep, the beams lost a little confidence. Brace 1, May called, voice as crisp as the heat made it possible to be. 3, 2, now. Her hands lifted and the air above her went wavy. Lava did not pour. Nobody survived that. It rolled forward in a disciplined lip that kissed the bracing rivets under the temple's first pylon and deposited exactly enough heat to turn metal traitor. The pylon groaned. The platform tilted 4 degrees. On a surveyor's diagram that angle would be nothing. On a floating temple it became a decision trees couldn't make. Hold, Yorua said, and her voice split in 2, the quiet command she sent to threads. And the louder one she used on people. Hold the line or it writes over us. She strode into the nearest beam and did not burn. The seals on her forearms flared gentle yellow. Papers fluttered around her wrist like birds and nested against the air. She pressed an anchor seal into the beam and the beam changed its mind about being a spear and decided to be a column. She tied it to a pylon. Not to pin the light but to remind it of gravity. Bind, she said, as if singing to her own doubt. The column trembled and then softened, agreeably annoyed. Up on the temple rim, something moved like a shadow in a mirror. Karen stumbled into view with a chain around one ankle and a grin that looked like she was about to do something stupid on purpose. An inquisitor on her left shoved. She headbutted him in the sternum and took his wind on principle. I've been chewing your wires, she shouted down to no one in particular, voice carried on a draft that shouldn't have helped and did. They taste like lies. Tenmei stepped forward into the high glare the way people step onto stages. He didn't glow. He threw nothing. He wore noon like a habit. He looked down at Naruto. Then at the people fanned along the ridge, then back at Naruto. It wasn't enough, he said, almost sorrowing. The time you hacked at my hero. The time you pretended to make law when all you made was permission to sin gracefully. You keep choosing the smaller good. You make a monument out of compromise. Naruto walked up the air ramp as far as the twilight ring would allow. It stopped him a pace short of Tenmei's reach. The way a good oath stops a bad impulse. You still talking like the world is a stain, he said. Maybe get your hands in it. If I touch your knight, it wins, Tenmei said. He turned his face and the fragments at his belt woke like dogs who'd heard their names. He unknotted them and they rose. Two glowed brass and sharp, one white hot and thin, one so pale it hurt to look at. The day is a mercy you don't deserve. He stepped into the fragments. The temple shadow peeled off the ramp and ran away. Noon poured down not in beams but in an absence of shadow. A circle widening from Tenmei's feet to swallow edge, seam, and mistake. Even the chalk dust cringed. Evaporation found sweat and tried to make a case about it. Naruto's twilight ring narrowed and hissed. He could feel his skin learning what steel feels like when the forge insists. Kurama dug claws into his ribs. Don't go up. Bring him down. On it, Naruto thought, and raised both hands. Hinata. She was already moving. Veil gathered, eyes white and wide. He shouted targets without thinking. She heard the map behind the words. Left conduit under the scorched vein, then the one nested inside the halo. Then 2 inches above his right elbow. There's a tenketsu in the light there. I see it, she said, gentle palm rising, 2 fingers extended, and stepped into Tenmei's glare like she owned the floor. Her strike wasn't a hit. It was a correction. The first conduit shivered and folded. Tenmei's noon hiccuped. She struck again, smaller, meaner, higher up, tapping the light where it thought it was muscle. The halo around his head frayed, then re-knit itself angry. Tenmei lifted a hand like a conductor asking a violin to cut it out. Hinata's knees stumbled. Naruto was there, body to body, intercepting the column she'd tricked into a curve so it broke over his shoulder like a hot wave. The mark flared. He grunted, caught her forearm, and breathed their rhythm back into sync. I've got the heavy, he said. You keep ruining his bow. She nodded once, without performing gratitude, and took the third mark, the precise, 2 inches above elbow touch that turned a river of glare into a garden hose. Tenmei's fingers flexed involuntarily. He hissed, and it was the first inelegant sound he'd made. Mei laughed low and thrilled and melted the second brace like she'd been born for insults that sound like physics. The temple listed. Guards grabbed for anything that thought about being a handhold. Karen used the slant to slam her chain against a pylon joint. It burst in a storm of spa. RKS that smelled like a blacksmith with bad manners. Nightingales cut their hush with a new chord, a counter hymn that made the air judge a little slower and listen a little more. Wolves howled once, a pivot call. Then changed directions without losing speed, a pack executed like math. Yorua tied an oath on the fly. She looped a thread around the wrists of a mist lieutenant and a dusk wolf runner. And spoke into it a rule. You two do not break rank no matter which old grudge tries to cash its check. The thread bit, not cruel, just persuasive, and the little vices that live in men during long fights took a step back. Shien's seals bled light that didn't burn, golden and tired and kind. She pressed one against a chain of soul captures strung under the temple's lip and whispered, not today. The way a baker tells dough to wait its turn. The chain sagged and dropped prisoners like terrible fruit. White ash runners caught them in shade capes and slid them to ground. Up above, Karen ran for the highest step like she was late to a joke. 2 inquisitors reached for her and got bitten for their trouble, by her, and by her chakra, which snapped like a thrown wire and put numbness in their thumbs. Get me a hinge, she hollered. Not expecting anyone to know what she meant and stage whispering it anyway in case the universe was listening. A big stupid one. 2 breaths, Naruto called back. Because sometimes the universe needs specificity. Tenmei dropped from the rim and landed 10 paces away, not because he needed the drama but because he liked the angle. The noon he'd woven around himself crawled like something alive. Where it touched the twilight ring, it hissed, 2 polite monsters sharing a fence. You can't keep both, Tenmei said quietly, curious as a man in his library. Quote, A law that lets you feed and a law that forbids your old hunger. A night that keeps its teeth and a day that forgives them. You are tearing yourself in half. Naruto flexed his hands. The brand sang under his skin. The nocturne breath playing counterpoint. He thought of Ray asleep under a lamp and of a nightingale's last note. Compromise is not cutting things in half, he said. It's choosing not to crush everything you don't understand. Tenmei stepped in, close. He didn't swing. He pushed down with will that had learned to be architecture. The ring shrank to a bracelet around Naruto's ribcage. Pain sang quick, bright. Naruto's knees dipped and held. Kurama's growl went low and patient. Give him something to hit that isn't you. Naruto went still, not statue. The still of nocturne. Space widening inside pain. Breath measuring weight. He let Tenmei's noon punch through the ring and kiss his shoulder where Kachis's blade had left a smarting memory. The hit landed and did what it meant to do. It drew blood. And with blood came shadow. Not much. Enough. He moved. The Rasengan he palmed didn't roar. It collected itself like a thought that won't leave. He fed it wind. A lean, cutting pin, and oath thread. A red line that could remember promises and break cheats. And foxfire, old and unruly power tamed to a simmer for once in its life. Then he gave it the quiet he'd learned under the bell. Star flicker without blaze. The sphere came on dark. Not black. There is a difference. Dark like the inside of an eclipse you look at through smoked glass. Its edge bit light. Where it rolled, GLA. Ri forgot what it was doing and asked questions. Tenmei recognized a threat when he saw one. He kicked off glare and rose, trying to widen the field and erase shadows from under Naruto's feet. Naruto went up with him. Twilight ring groaning, shoulder bleeding and happy about it. Hinata cleared a path with 3 precise strikes to the air at nothing. The nothing flinched because she had found the points light uses to breathe. Mei, Naruto called, breath thin. Hinge, left, Mei replied, and poured a tongue of lava into the temple's high seam. Metal surrendered, light sagged. The platform tilted 3 degrees in the other direction, then 2 more, then paused, uncertain. Karen jumped. She caught the tilting seam with both hands, jammed her heel into a joint you couldn't have put a thumb into without losing the thumb. And laughed like a woman who'd just gotten a joke she'd been waiting on for 10 years. I've got your hinge, she yelled. Do it. Tenmei gathered noon into his right palm and shaped it needle thin. He aimed at Naruto's heart. Naruto let his own heart be the fulcrum. He dropped the Rasengan as if his arm were tired. Tenmei's eyes flicked to the weakness a hair too long. Naruto stepped forward, deliberately into the needle, felt it hit bone, and used the stab to pull his own body into Tenmei's shadow. The sphere ate the noon. Not greedily, cleanly. It took light and stripped it down to the part that isn't cruel. The oath thread flared in it, reading the fragments' rules and asking them to hand in their weapons. Foxfire kept the spin hot where it needed heat. E-Star quiet kept it from exploding and turning the temple into a story told at funerals. Tenmei froze because even a man who trains his face can be surprised when the thing he loves most is allowed keep living and asked to stop killing at the same time. Shion screamed a word Naruto had never heard anyone scream without it ruining a building. It slipped through the sphere like water through cloth and wrapped the core in mercy. Choice, Naruto said, to the sphere, to Tenmei, to himself. He could collapse the light and let it die ugly. He could lock it under the ocean and tell himself that was justice. He could give it back to the sky like a man letting go of a bird who has never been a pet. He remembered the nightingale's voice breaking in the desert. He remembered Ray's bowl of stew. He remembered the way Pain had stopped trying to be king when he let it sit at his table and gave it a job that wasn't breaking him. He opened his hand. The sphere unspooled into a billion motes. Dawn sparks. Not noon. Never noon. The cruel edge dissolved. Brightness broke into small, ordinary suns, the kind that kiss rooftops and warm wet laundry and make old cats stretch. The motes rose, learning how to be morning again, and ran up through the temple's gullet into the sky where they belonged. The day caught them like a parent catching a kid jumping off a porch and pretended to have been ready the whole time. The temple shuddered. The no-shadow field snapped like a snare that had overreached. Light fell back into beams. Shadows returned, sketching claws under handrails and safety under feet. Tenmei dropped, knees bending. One hand catching the rim. He looked smaller, not weak, human-sized in a way that made him dangerous for different reasons. You should have killed me, he said, breathing like a person who had underestimated how much bodies weigh. Probably, Naruto said, but I want to see what you do without the thing that lied to you most. Tenmei's laugh was a single, bright arc that had a little boy in it he would never admit to. I get better at killing you, he said. He looked up into the wash of motes and the stubborn morning they promised. His mouth tightened. Or I learned to pray. Karen yanked her foot out of the seam and flipped him a rude gesture that somehow carried pathos. Eat a sandwich, she suggested. He went up and away on the scraps of glare still answering him. Not because he was running. The momentum tasted more like retreat than rout, and more like vow than either. Yorui's threads shot for his shadow. He saw them and skated sideways at the last second, a dancer refusing a net. He vanished into a noon that wasn't noon anymore. The temple listed. The braces were mostly soup. The pylons were confused. The prisoners, too many, shouted and wept and looked around for orders. The vigil line cracked in 2 places at once. One knot threw down talismans and raised hands as if they weighed 100 pounds each. Another tightened formation and began to cut a retreat corridor with the efficiency of men who had practiced losing without dying. Don't let it fall, Xian said, already running, because nobody needs a giant temple collapsing on their fishing grounds for a century. She slapped radiant anchors onto 3 points of air that looked like they couldn't hold a kitten and made them hold a building. Give me pillars. Mei gave her steam. Hot, clean, proprietary, just the right density to bear a little weight. White ash hauled shade pylons up the cliff like ants arguing a stick up a wall. Nightingales slid their song up into the frightened squeal the braces had adopted and gave it something to lean on. Wolves took the retreat corridor the hard vigil had cleared and turned it into a path anyone could use without getting stabbed. Hinata climbed. Naruto saw where she was headed and wanted to tell her not to. He didn't. Trust lives where fear is allowed to stay and not drive. The halo conduits she'd broken once had begun to knuckle together again. Compromise knitting back into cruelty out of habit. She moved over them lightly. Tenketsu strikes with the grace of a person moving cups on a table before water spills, not a fighter smashing plates. She struck, corrected, softening the halo until it sighed itself out like a bad thought that wanted a nap. Karen found the cord they'd used to yank her through reflections and kicked it twice for good measure. You don't get to call that a design, she told it. That was a tantrum with sequins. Status, Naruto called, because if he didn't make the word a habit it would come out as I'm not losing any more people today. Yorui's voice cut to him through everything like a thread under a seam. Alive, she said, more than we deserve, less than we want, we can hold, your majesty, finish it. He didn't know whether she meant the temple or the law. Either way, he knew. He walked to the edge of the rim and faced the vigil men who hadn't fled. He lifted his palm and showed them the brand, hot and precise, and the skin around it, mortal and unoffended by being mortally warm. I don't need your kneeling, he said. You can keep your prayers. But if you want to walk away from this with your jaws and your oaths unbroken, you sign our accords. Consent. No pray. No secret kill rooms. Mixed patrols with radiant seals binding both ways. If you want to break us, do it in the open, to our face. A commander with talisman ink stained into his fingers and the long, tired spine of a man whose house burned a decade ago, looked at Naruto, at the motes thinning into morning. At Xian sweating through a hymn to keep a pillar standing, at a dusk wolf teaching a kid how to breathe steady between sobs. He put his strip of paper down on the stone and held his empty hands up. I've hated worse men for less, he said, and the corners of his mouth turned down in a way that meant he didn't like what he was saying and would do it anyway. Fine, we'll walk your roads until they break. If they don't, we'll stop trying to break them. That's how roads work, Naruto said softly. It took the rest of the morning to settle bodies and beams in a building that wanted to be history. Xian's pillars became white ash pylons in a neat handover nobody had rehearsed and everyone pretended was obvious. Mei requisitioned scaffolding from fishermen with bribes and threats. In mist, those 2 words share a trunk. Nightingales sang goodbyes to the awful light and lullabies to the motes, which pretended not to listen and softened anyway. Karen sat on the temple rim kicking her heels and started cataloging. Her list of things they'd broken and things that had almost broken them was profane and useful. "We should make sandwiches named after our worst mistakes," she told the White Ash Elder. "So we eat them and remember not to be stupid." "We already have those," he said dryly. "They're called rations." Wolves ran water. People drank. Kids let their shoulders unlearn their bad posture. Yorua walked the ruin with her hands behind her back and an expression that told the ruin she respected it and might knife it if it tried anything. When she reached Naruto she looked at H. "I am like a person reads a ledger's last line. You made an enemy who can pray," she said. "He made himself," Naruto said. "I just let the morning do what mornings do when you stop yelling at them." She nodded, thoughtful, and tied a tiny knot at her wrist that told her threads not to jump at shadows that looked like sun. The vigil fractured. Some retreated with discipline. Some gave up. Some vanished, into the nooks that always exist between law and story. The city that would be made of night and day together looked back at Naruto and waited to see if he would keep being the same person when the heat left. He signed the accords again in the open air, in daylight, with ink that hadn't yet learned to dry fast when it was proud. The Dusk Wolf Alpha pressed a paw print, no joke, next to his name and let people deal with being charmed or not. Xian set radiant seals at the entrances to the temple's gut, not to guard, but to invite. White Ash stonemasons bickered over angles and found a kindness inside the bickering. It's how they flirt. That night, the Umbral City pushed a law through every lamp. Consent required. Patrols mixed. Courts open 2 nights a week for complaints nobody wanted to hear and nobody could afford to ignore. The first blood bank opened with less ceremony than a bakery. Kajhisa, exiled by oath, tested a door from far away and found his shadow nailed to a building he didn't believe in. He smiled and called it an interesting problem, which from him was a vow. Naruto slept standing once and woke up because Hinata didn't let him fall. He tried to find the words to make the day finish right and decided to skip straight to the thing that mattered most. "Come up," he said, nodding toward a rooftop with a low lip and 5 terracotta pots that thought about being basil once. Hinata climbed beside him, soft steps and a slide to keep the tiles from complaining. The city's night breathed, lamps pacing their glow. Dawn sparks drifted thin across the sky like slow confetti finally willing to land. He didn't plan a speech. He had made enough of those without making them. He stood with his hands on the edge and watched the motes gather into something that might be mourn. In an hour if everyone could be patient for once. You know the thing where we both almost died because we like terrible errands? He asked. "Which one?" She said. "Automatic," and they both laughed, small and unforced. He turned, shoulder bandaged and the mark asleep. He fit his body into the space her presence made, a space he trusted. "I keep wanting to promise you safety," he said, the words slow enough that they didn't trample each other. "And then I remember that's not how this works. So I'm promising this. I will keep choosing the stubborn, small right when the loud thing grabs my throat. I will keep letting you punch the light in the ribs before I swing. I will ask for permission when I'm hungry. I will not pull you into a fire to prove to a stranger I can carry weight." Her mouth curved. "I prefer that last one," she said. Then, a breath later, "I knew you before the crown. I liked you then. I like you now. If you forget either, I'll tell you." "Okay," he said, because it was the best word he owned. He leaned in a little. She tilted up. It wasn't dramatic. It was a yes to a quiet promise made 100 times in the spaces between louder ones. He tasted sweat and dust and the sweet shadow the crown wore today. She tasted pine and bread and somebody else's laughter curling in her chest because the city was laughing somewhere and that counts. When they broke, she pressed her forehead to his. The motes above them drew thin lines across the dark like someone was practicing constellations and had to invent new ones to keep up. He closed his eyes because the moment didn't need them open. "You know," he murmured, "I think the sky just made a promise. Then we'll keep it together," she said, stealing his line because it fit her better. Down below, Ray taught a pup ho. W to cheat at dice and then told them not to because cheating is work and you won't sleep right afterward. Karen stole a cog and called it a souvenir and planned 3 schools out loud between yawns and rude words. May wrote a letter to the daimyo she wouldn't send and signed it with a joke that would have started a trade war if anyone else wrote it. Shion ate soup and admitted she liked, a little, the idea of a shrine with a window. Yorua walked the lamps and listened to the threads hum contentment without falling asleep, the way good locks do. Out at sea, on a line between clouds, something blinked wrong. A star cut its light and then opened it again as if winking. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't not a threat. Yorua stopped and looked up. "Your Majesty," she said conversationally to nobody. The way a steward catalogs the day before it catches fire again. "The sky is practicing." Naruto kissed Hinata's forehead and leaned on the edge of the roof. He didn't plan a new law. He didn't pick a fight with a star. He stood in his city, in the mouth of night, and let morning come without telling it how. Chapter 5 End.